The war had dragged on for years, a brutal, unforgiving grind that turned the landscape into a graveyard, with the earth itself choked by the bodies of the fallen. Deep within the center of this horrific carnage, a man suddenly lurched, his body racked by a violent cough that expelled a thick, crimson spray of blood as he reeled from an impact that ought to have been his final moment. The sacred blade of the knightly order had found its mark with chilling precision, the steel buried deep within his chest, pinning him to the spot. The surrounding soldiers erupted into a collective roar of triumph, their voices heavy with the overwhelming relief of men who were finally waking up from a decade-long nightmare. The man currently bleeding out upon the dirt was known across the entire land as the feared demon of the continent, Ashimon. He was the most powerful and dreaded necromancer to ever walk the world, a sorcerer of unmatched, terrifying ability. As his life force rapidly bled away, the Archmage felt the cold grip of death, realizing that his time had finally run out. For 10 grueling years, he had been trapped in a war that had bled into every corner of the realm, and he had poured everything into fortifying his defenses against this final, desperate assault. Yet, in the final accounting of things, his dark spells had simply failed to hold back the tide. Glancing at the grim pile of skulls scattered beside him, he accepted the reality of his situation. This was his perfect, absolute defeat. And the man solely responsible for his downfall was none other than the lone knight standing directly before him, Burkle Rhineland. However, the leader of the knights didn't move to claim the glory for himself, standing tall but humble before his dying foe. His voice rumbled with a heavy, solemn weight as he explained that this victory hadn't been won by his hand alone. Countless souls had fought, suffered, and died just so his sword could finally breach the necromancer's guard. Burkle urged the Archmage to surrender immediately, making one final, desperate plea for the sake of peace and for the common people who had suffered far too long. This plea only served to ignite a flickering spark of rage in Ashimon, who let out a ragged, defiant scream, snarling at the knight to keep his mouth shut. With pure venom dripping from his words, he accused the knights of cowardice, claiming they had stood idly by while a horrific plague slaughtered the innocent, viewing these holy warriors as far worse than any common beast. He spat out the final words of his tirade, branding every single one of them a pathetic, self-righteous hypocrite. Suddenly, a sickly, neon-green aura began to pulse erratically from Ashimon's shattered body as he forced himself to rise, his muscles straining against the pain. The surrounding soldiers watched in absolute terror, stunned that he could still summon the strength to channel such dark necromancy despite his heart being pierced. While his comrades shouted frantic warnings about the mounting danger, Burkle remained fixed, commanding the mage to abandon his madness. He reminded the mage of the catastrophic cost of this war, noting that 20 million people had lost their lives, only to be forcibly raised as mindless puppets in the necromancer's undead legion. Ashimon didn't flinch, his expression remaining frigid as he mocked the knight for his perceived stupidity and moral blindness. Burkle then struck a raw nerve, cutting through the insults to accuse the mage of being driven by nothing more than a twisted, pathetic desire for vengeance for his own fallen kin. The necromancer sneered and challenged the knight to prove him wrong, and for a long, heavy moment, Burkle fell completely silent. The knight then spoke of the true purpose that had fueled his crusade, staring down his enemy with eyes radiating unwavering resolve, his sword beginning to glow with a brilliant, golden light. He declared with absolute conviction that every drop of blood he had spilled, and every sacrifice made, was purely for the sake of the future and the children who would inherit the world. At those words, the Archmage's body went completely rigid, his movements stalling as the statement hit home. The hero spoke passionately of the need to leave behind a lasting legacy of hope for the next generation, rather than a cycle of endless hatred. In that fragile moment, something within Ashimon finally shattered. Reflected in the depths of Burkle's eyes, he saw his own corrupted, monstrous form, but looking past the horror, he caught a glimpse of a long-buried ghost of his former self. He saw the pure, justice-filled gaze of the man he used to be, a knight fundamentally different from the twisted monster he had ultimately become. As Burkle prepared his strike, envisioning the generations to come, the necromancer was overcome by a wave of shock. His remaining strength evaporated, and he collapsed, dropping to his knees in the blood-soaked dirt. The knight raised his sword high once more, steeling himself to deliver the final blow that would mark the end of the demon of the continent. The pivotal moment had arrived, the final stroke that would bring an end to the chaos of the past decade. But just as Burkle lunged forward, he unexpectedly stumbled, his footing betraying him, causing his men to gasp in alarm at the sudden, inexplicable lapse. Seizing that split-second opening, Ashimon gripped a secondary blade etched with pulsing, dark runes and hissed a final, chilling taunt at his executioner. He asked Burkle if he had any last words, his lips curling into a gory, triumphant smile as he declared that ending the life of a man like him was never going to be quite that simple. Even while drenched in his own lifeblood, it was clear that the Necromancer had been holding back one final, lethal card to play. Suddenly, a violent, roiling wave of shadowy energy erupted from his core, surging toward Burkle with terrifying, concussive force. The knight was blasted backward by the sheer raw pressure, while Ashemon's eyes ignited with a strange, dark, and mysterious power. Holding his runic blade high, the mage channeled his remaining will into a final, desperate act of vengeance against the world that had cast him out. A blinding explosion of light swallowed the entire battlefield, and as the dust began to clear, the soldiers cheered, certain that their enemy had finally been defeated. Lying broken and defeated on the ground, the mage heard the sickening, final crack of his own neck as the light left his vision. As the distant sounds of victory cheers grew faint, his consciousness finally drifted away, his eyes closing slowly on the blurred, dark silhouette of the figure standing over him. And just like that, the 10-year war that had ravaged the continent and stolen countless lives finally reached its end. This marked the definitive death of the demon of the continent, the legendary necromancer known as Ashemon. Yet, in the very heartbeat that should have been his final expiration, something truly inexplicable began to stir. The perspective shifted abruptly, moving away from the battlefield to a massive, opulent mansion shrouded in the darkness of a raging, thunderous storm. Inside, two maids were hovering nearby, buzzing with startled excitement as they realized the young master's lips had just twitched for the very first time. Confused by the sudden warmth and the completely unfamiliar surroundings, the mage wondered in a haze of bewilderment what on earth was happening to him. He opened his eyes to a second life, reborn as a helpless baby named Cleanse, with absolutely no idea what world he had fallen into or how he had ended up there in the first place. One of the maids gently held up a portrait before him, pointing to the elegant duchess in the frame and telling him that the woman in the painting was his mother. When the maid leaned closer and tried to coax a word out of him, Cleanse felt his tiny infant body tense up with all the strength it could muster. His small face tightened, his limbs stiffened, and with a struggle far too intense for a baby, he desperately tried to push actual words from his mouth. The maids stared in complete shock. To the maids, it looked like a miracle, as if this little prodigy was about to speak his very first words. But the truth was completely different. Cleanse was not trying to call for his mother or babble like an ordinary child. He was trying to summon his dark servants and command them to obey him. Inside, he was screaming for his servants to answer his call and come before him at once. But to the women surrounding the crib, all they heard was the loud, frightened crying of an ordinary infant. At that exact moment, lightning ripped across the night sky. A violent white flash burst through the darkness, lighting up the entire mansion so fiercely that, for one breathless instant, the whole estate seemed swallowed by that blinding glow. And just like that, as if time itself had been swept away in a single blink, 15 years passed. Now the mansion garden looked peaceful beneath the warm afternoon sun, and the fountain at its center glittered brightly as water danced and shimmered in the light. Near the fountain, several young ladies stood together, their eyes wide and their faces filled with a mixture of honest surprise, excitement, and breathless admiration. Across the spacious estate, a young man moved with calm confidence, his steps smooth and steady, carrying himself with the relaxed elegance of someone who had grown up surrounded by luxury. The girls could not help whispering among themselves as he passed, completely captivated by his sharp, beautiful features and the way his long hair flowed around him. Then his full appearance came into view, leaving them even more stunned than before. Standing before them was a breathtakingly handsome young man, with hair so pale and pure it looked like freshly fallen snow. His face was almost unreal in its perfection, so flawless and refined that it seemed less like the work of human birth and more like something carefully carved by the hands of the gods themselves. The young ladies sighed dreamily, unable to hold back their praise as they gushed over how dazzling young Master Cleanse had become. One of them even wondered aloud what kind of food a person had to eat to grow into such divine beauty. They were left floating in their own fantasies, wondering what heavenly nectar someone would need to drink just to look that graceful and otherworldly. But their sweet little daydream was shattered in an instant when a man came stomping through the garden toward Cleanse, dragging a heavy bucket in his hands. Without the slightest warning, he hurled the contents over the young man, soaking him in holy water while shouting for the evil spirit inside that body to leave at once. This man was Garrison, a priest who had believed from the very beginning that something was terribly wrong with young Cleanse. Dripping wet and looking utterly unimpressed, Cleanse stood there as Garrison pointed sharply toward the three nearby girls, accusing them of already being bewitched by the boy's dark influence. Cleanse, soaked from head to toe, simply looked at the priest and asked whether he ever got tired of repeating the same ridiculous purification ritual over and over again. But Garrison refused to back down. With absolute conviction in his voice, he insisted that the soul of the Archmage Ashimon was living inside the boy's body. Cleanse tried to deny it, saying he was not a necromancer at all. But the moment Garrison caught sight of that cold, irritated look in his eyes, the priest flinched as if he had seen proof of evil itself, then splashed him with yet another bucket of holy water. As Cleanse turned and walked away, water dripping from his clothes, he muttered under his breath, wondering whether the priest had completely lost his mind and quietly calling him a psychopath. Unfortunately, Garrison heard him clearly. His expression twisted with anger, and he immediately ordered his men to grab Cleanse and drag him away, declaring that the boy needed to be thrown into a bath of boiled water to finally learn his lesson. As the young man was seized and pulled along, his thoughts drifted back to the moment his previous life had ended. He could still remember his execution with painful clarity. Every detail burned into his mind as if it had happened only yesterday. After that death came the unbearable shock of waking up inside a newborn's body, and because the first words he tried to speak had been a dark necromantic incantation, everything went wrong from the very beginning. From the moment he was born, people looked at him not as a child, but as a demon. It was while he was still trapped in that weak and helpless infant state that he first encountered Garrison, the priest from the Holy Order. Cleanse could still picture that enormous silhouette looming over his tiny body, the priest's presence casting a long, oppressive shadow across his earliest memories. That first meeting became the starting point of 15 long years filled with nothing but misery. His childhood was not filled with warmth or peace. Instead, it included endless 24-hour prayer sessions that seemed to continue without mercy, day and night. There were forced baths in freezing garlic water, and so-called purifying fire ceremonies where he was tied to a cross and displayed in front of everyone like some cursed creature. Under the excuse of sacred rituals, Cleanse had been forced to suffer nearly every kind of torment imaginable. Now, 15 years later, he sat at his own party with a face full of open disgust, looking as though he would rather be anywhere else in the world. Beside him, his personal maid Erin clasped her hands together and prayed with all her heart that he would one day follow the noble legacy of a hero. But Cleanse had completely run out of patience with the suffocating religious mood around him. His face darkened, he rose from his seat, and with one sharp motion, he flung his party hat across the room. Erin's expression immediately crumbled. Looking genuinely hurt, she complained that she had made that hat with her own hands and poured her whole heart into it. Seeing how crushed she looked, Cleanse felt a sudden stab of guilt. His anger softened for a moment, and he started walking over to pick up the hat and apologize. But that small bit of sympathy vanished the instant Erin admitted that Priest Garrison had actually been the one who made it. Cleanse stopped dead in his tracks, his face twisting with pure horror and deep, instinctive disgust. Right then, Garrison appeared behind him as if summoned by the worst possible timing, his booming voice ringing out as he called Cleanse's name. The priest looked as though he was about to burst into tears, deeply touched by the idea that Cleanse had supposedly worn the hat for an entire week without ever taking it off. Cleanse responded without hesitation. He picked up the hat, dropped it beneath his foot, and crushed it flat under his heel, smiling coldly as he declared that he would never wear such garbage again. Garrison instantly exploded with rage, screaming that the evil spirit of Ashimon had finally shown its true nature. But before the confrontation could spiral any further, the heated atmosphere was suddenly interrupted. Commander Dunkel arrived without warning, and the moment he stepped into the garden, the heavy tension shifted at once. His firm voice cut cleanly through the chaos, as he remarked that rumors about Cleanse being the reincarnation of Ashimon had already been spreading for more than 10 years. He then reminded Garrison that the Holy Order itself had officially investigated the child and declared that there was nothing abnormal about him. The moment those words reached him, Garrison's attitude changed. He immediately loosened his grip on Cleanse and nodded respectfully, agreeing with Commander Dunkel without the slightest resistance. As Cleanse scrambled up from the floor, he understood something with chilling clarity. Garrison could ignore him, torment him, and treat him like a demon, but the priest obeyed Dunkel instantly. That meant he was not merely a blind fanatic. He was more like a shark, someone who knew exactly when to bare his teeth and when to play along with the rules of power. As Garrison turned to leave the hall, he suddenly stopped and glanced back one last time. With a faint, unsettling warning, he said there was always a chance that something could still happen far off in the future. After leaving everyone with that ominous farewell, Garrison finally said goodbye, only to poke his head back in a moment later and cheerfully remind Cleanse that their next session was still waiting. The next purification ritual had already been set for the coming Friday. Cleanse watched Garrison wave as if he were giving some friendly farewell, while the boy's blood simmered with silent fury. Through clenched teeth, he muttered that until that day came, he would endure it. Once he was finally left alone, Cleanse's restraint snapped. He drove his fist hard into the sofa, the cushion sinking beneath the blow as all the frustration he had been holding back burst out at once. No matter how many times he thought about it, he could not understand how a man could torture a child so deliberately for years, then still be praised by everyone around him as some righteous and holy cleric. Erin slowly approached with a towel in her hands, her steps careful and hesitant. In a quiet voice, she finally asked the question that had clearly weighed on her heart for years. Was he truly no longer the Archmage? Cleanse denied it with every ounce of strength in his body. His expression hardened, and he swore that he never wanted to hear that cursed name again for as long as he lived. But deep inside, his mind was anything but calm. Behind that fierce denial, countless secrets churned like a storm, and he knew better than anyone that he could never reveal the truth to a single living soul. Ever since his rebirth, his life had been nothing more than a luxurious prison. Because of the rumors surrounding him, every movement had been watched, and he had even been locked inside a monastery for 7 unbearable years. Wanting to escape the heavy topic, Cleanse changed direction and asked about the executor, wondering whether that title belonged to someone important. The man beside him grew noticeably more serious at the question. In a low, respectful voice, he explained that within the Holy Order, the title of executor was given to the strongest warrior they had, and that answer genuinely caught Cleanse off guard. It was said that almost no one in the world could stand against an executor. The only exception was the Duke from Cleanse's own noble family, a man powerful enough to be mentioned in the same breath. Hearing just how overwhelming his bloodline's strength was, Cleanse's eyes brightened with rare excitement. He brought his hands together and began clapping, genuinely impressed for once. Filled with sudden curiosity, he asked who had been known as the strongest duke in the entire history of their house. The man answered carefully, saying that the 7th Duke, Cleanse's own father, was certainly a fearsome figure, but the 1st Duke still stood at the very peak of their family's strength. Cleanse blinked in surprise. He had assumed the current generation had already reached the height of the family's power, so hearing that someone from the distant past surpassed them left him taken aback. Yet the man did not waver at all. His voice remained steady as he insisted that the founder of the family was truly unmatched. Seeing how intensely the young master had taken interest in the topic, the man softened his tone and simply went along with Cleanse's excitement, agreeing in a way that seemed meant to please him. Erin noticed that Cleanse's attention had drifted away from the conversation. His eyes were now fixed on one particular portrait hanging on the wall of the Grand Hall. Commander Dunkel silently considered the strange irony of it all, thinking that no one in this world could have predicted such a twisted turn of fate. 200 years had passed since the 1st Duke founded their house, and as Cleanse stood before the grand gallery of ancestors, he still could not fully process the absurd reality of the life he had been reborn into. His gaze moved slowly across the portraits of the men who had carried the family name before him, until his eyes finally stopped on the very 1st Duke, the strongest figure in the entire lineage. There, surrounded by a golden frame and staring back with eyes full of unshakable justice, was the 1st Duke of the Rhineland family himself, Berkel Rhineland. The necromancer Ashimon had not simply been reborn into a new life. By some cruel twist of fate, he had returned as a direct descendant of the very man who had killed him. The echo of his own final scream still seemed to ring in his ears, especially the moment he remembered spitting out his enemy's name with his dying breath. He could still feel the crushing weight of Berkel's words, that infuriatingly righteous declaration that all the bloodshed had been for the sake of the children's future. And after that final, merciless strike, the feared necromancer had fallen from the sky, defeated and broken, plummeting toward the frozen earth blanketed in snow. Cleanse suddenly jolted awake in his bed. His chest rose and fell heavily as he struggled to steady his breathing, his body sinking into the soft mattress of his luxurious suite. He cursed under his breath, furious that the nightmare of his past life kept returning to haunt him again and again. Centuries ago, he had been a monster of pure malice, a terrifying existence who had nearly crushed the entire continent beneath his power. But in the end, he had been cut down by a hero, only to be thrown back into the world 200 years later in an entirely different body. Cleanse ran a hand through his snow-white hair and stared at his own delicate appearance with a grimace, unable to connect this fragile, elegant reflection with the monstrous being he used to be. The thick silence of the room was suddenly broken by a cold voice from the doorway, mocking him for talking in his sleep again. Priest Garrison stood there with a sinister, knowing grin on his face. He began pressing Cleanse about those memories, forcing the young master to hurriedly claim that he was only exhausted. Before Cleanse could fully recover, his red-haired maid Erin burst into the room in a panic. Flustered and loud, she blurted out that she had overheard his dark sleep talk, then began repeating his villainous mutterings right there in front of everyone. Cleanse panicked instantly and lunged toward her, desperately trying to stop her from saying another word. He pleaded with her to keep quiet before the situation became even worse, but by then, it was already too late. The head butler arrived at that exact moment, standing straight as he announced that the family sword exhibition was about to begin. After hearing the reports about Cleanse's strange behavior, Garrison's expression turned cold. He declared that the boys' purification sessions would be doubled, while Cleanse quickly clamped a hand over Erin's mouth to stop her from making things even worse. The young heir trembled where he stood, his body shaking from a mixture of suppressed rage, disbelief, and the unbearable unfairness of the situation. As they made their way toward the courtyard, Cleanse cursed Garrison in his mind with every insult he could think of, more convinced than ever that the priest was a complete lunatic. Trying to focus on something else, he turned toward the servants and asked about the sword event. The butler explained that the Duke himself had personally ordered Cleanse to attend the ceremony. Cleanse was surprised that his father had suddenly taken an interest in him. As that thought crossed his mind, he reached out for a handkerchief offered by a young maid nearby. The mustachioed butler immediately snapped at the girl for disturbing the master, but Cleanse stepped in before she could shrink away in fear. Instead of scolding her, he defended her and handed her a biscuit, sending the girl into pure, happy, munching bliss. As Cleanse looked out over the grand estate, he quietly tried to figure out why his father had summoned him so suddenly. Then the butler revealed the second reason behind the gathering. Relatives from the family's secondary branch had come to visit. The moment Cleanse heard that, his expression darkened. He already knew exactly what kind of irritating political performance was waiting for him. As soon as he entered the hall, the noble relatives gathered around like vultures, their eyes lighting up with open malice the moment they saw him. They wasted no time mocking him, deliberately bringing up the name of the ancient villain just to watch his reaction and see whether they could make him flinch. The group laughed among themselves, loudly reminding everyone that the so-called demon child had spent 7 miserable years wasting away inside a monastery. Cleanse observed them with cold, calculating eyes. He immediately recognized the gluttonous relatives from the northern branch, people who had clearly only come here to eat and drink for free. Then his gaze moved toward a blonde girl whose posture practically overflowed with arrogance. She was another relative from a side branch, and from the look on her face, she seemed more than ready to turn the family gathering into a battlefield of insults. The girl from the western branch stood with an air of icy superiority, her eyes sweeping across the room as though everyone around her was too insignificant to deserve her attention. Cleanse ignored every petty jab and cutting insult thrown his way. Without giving the group the reaction they wanted, the primary heir simply walked straight past them, leaving the nobles fuming behind him. One of the cousins finally snapped, his patience breaking all at once. His face flushed red with anger as he glared at Cleanse and barked out a furious question, demanding to know whether this so-called piece of trash really planned to keep ignoring them inside his own family estate. The arrogant noble kept raising his voice, throwing his weight around as if the entire mansion belonged to him. But to the former archmage, the sight was almost laughable. These branch family members had walked into the main estate and were now acting like they were the true masters of the house. Cleanse's gaze turned cold enough to freeze the air around him as he answered in a flat, emotionless voice, saying he had never even bothered to remember the names of people like them. Deep inside, a faint trace of contempt stirred in him. If these little upstarts dared to behave this boldly within the main family's walls, then the Rhineland main line must have truly fallen far. Just then, the attention of everyone nearby drifted away from the argument and toward the arena, where the sharp clash of blades rang through the hall as 2 young swordsmen fought in the middle of an intense sparring match. A purple-haired youth charged in first, gripping his sword tightly as he poured all his anxious frustration into one desperate attack. His movements carried plenty of force, but the pressure weighing down on him was clearly becoming too much to handle. The moment his opponent answered with a counterattack, the purple-haired boy's stance collapsed. His body staggered backward, his feet failed to hold the ground, and he went tumbling down hard, landing in defeat before he could regain control. Humiliation burned across the purple-haired boy's face as he pushed himself up, his pride clearly wounded. Gritting his teeth, he demanded that his opponent stop holding back and face him seriously, insisting that he fight with everything he had. The golden-haired boy standing above him stayed perfectly composed. When the next wave of attacks came rushing in, he blocked each strike with smooth, almost effortless grace. A calm, confident smile rested on his lips as he made it clear that the match had already been decided. That dazzling young man was Delon Rhineland, Clen's older half-brother. Just from the way he stood there with his blade in hand, his overwhelming sense of superiority was impossible to miss. Delon was the one carrying the family's proud reputation on his shoulders, and Clen's watched the fight with sharpened focus. A faint mystical purple glow began to shimmer in his eyes as he activated his magical sight, carefully breaking down every detail of their abilities. Driven into a corner by desperation, Delon's opponent rushed forward again, shouting as if sheer willpower could change the outcome. He swore that this time, things would not end the same way. Delon moved the instant the challenge came. His body surged forward, and his sword flashed so quickly that the blade seemed to blur into a streak of light. His opponent tried to force a counterattack no matter the cost, swinging with everything he had left. Yet Delon never lost control for even a breath. He slipped through the incoming strikes with elegant precision and avoided a heavy downward slash as smoothly as flowing water. Then, in the next instant, a brilliant golden energy wrapped around Delon's body. His speed rose sharply, pushing beyond what normal eyes could follow, and it was obvious that he was preparing to unleash a special technique. Clen's captured every tiny movement with his glowing eyes. He studied Delon's footwork, the way his balance shifted through his legs, and the exact instant he pressed the tip of his toe against the ground to launch himself forward with explosive force. Blinded by anger and shame, the purple-haired rival gathered himself for one last decisive attack. His blade cut straight through the air, aimed directly at Delon's face as if he meant to settle everything in a single blow. Clen's watched in silent awe as even the hidden movement of mana within the Rhineland family's secret art became visible before his eyes. Nothing about the technique could escape his gaze. In the span of a heartbeat, Delon released his strike. The famous meteor sword technique exploded forward with terrifying force, and the blow landed cleanly in the center of his opponent's body. The judge reacted at once, cutting off the bout before it could continue and loudly declaring Delon the victor. As always, Delon carried himself like the perfect noble superior in front of the crowd. The blonde youth offered his defeated opponent a gentle, almost friendly smile, but behind that polite expression, he calmly pointed out that if the strike had landed with full intent, the other boy would have suffered a serious injury. Whispers of admiration spread through the gathered guests as they marveled at the execution of such an advanced technique. Watching from the side, Clen's understood the real purpose behind the display. This was not just a sparring victory. It was a carefully delivered warning aimed at the secondary families. After the match ended, Delon noticed his younger brother standing among the spectators. He walked over with a mocking grin, asking Clen's whether he had been watching for long and teasing that, had he known Clen's was there, he might have tried even harder. Delon's words carried that same smooth, playful tone, but the meaning underneath was sharp. He was making it clear that the performance Clen's had witnessed was not even the full extent of what he could do. Looking at his brother's flawless swordsmanship and that carefully worn mask of fake kindness, the ancient villain felt genuine disgust rise inside him. At the same time, another thought sharpened in his mind. What was the real reason all these branch families had been gathered here today? Then the atmosphere inside the grand hall changed in an instant, as though a heavy shadow had fallen across the room. Everyone felt the arrival of the seventh head of the clan. Duke Kenkel Rhineland's presence pressed down on the hall the moment he appeared. Clen's felt a sudden jolt of alarm as his father drew closer, and the entire room sank into a heavy, suffocating silence. The Duke gave his eldest son a rare nod of approval, acknowledging the enormous effort Delon had poured into reaching such a refined level of mastery with the sword. The former Archmage observed their exchange with a cold, cynical gaze. It was painfully obvious that Delon was not simply the Duke's favored son. He was the only source of pride left for both Kenkel and the Rhineland family. Commander Dunkel added his own praise, remarking that Delon's command over the blade was truly remarkable for someone so young. Delon played his part perfectly. The blonde youth lowered his head with polished humility, claiming in a modest tone that he still had a great deal left to learn. As the patriarch moved past them, he spoke briefly about the heroic legacy their family carried. Delon responded at once, bowing deeply with the appearance of absolute devotion and respect. Then the Duke's eyes shifted toward Clen's. The warmth he had shown Delon vanished completely, replaced by a frigid, cutting stare filled with undisguised contempt. He offered Clen's no kind words, no trace of affection, not even the barest sign of concern. The Duke simply stared at the silver-haired boy in silence, and that silence alone made his shame over this failed heir painfully clear. Then, under the stunned eyes of the assembled guests, the clan leader reached out and placed his hand on the silver-haired boy's head. After a brief moment, he coldly declared that he could not feel even a single spark of mana within him. Cleanse lowered his head and gave a quiet apology. He understood exactly what that meant in this world. For a noble to be born without magic was no different from being treated as already dead. At that moment, Commander Dunkel stepped forward and tried to defend him, suggesting that the years Cleanse had spent isolated in the monastery might have simply stunted his growth. But even with that explanation, the damage had already been done. The crowd immediately sank into ugly whispers. Guests murmured about the heir who had no mana at all, their voices dripping with mockery. Some even muttered that if the main line had fallen to such a useless state, then perhaps it was finally time for the branch families to take control. Later, as Cleanse walked alone through the long corridors, he told himself that he could endure the insults aimed at him personally. Words like that were nothing he could not bear. But then Burkle's famous words surfaced in his mind, the ones about protecting the future and carrying forward what mattered most. Cleanse's hands slowly tightened at his sides. His fists clenched so hard that his knuckles turned pale, and a tidal wave of rage began to surge through him from deep within. To the former Archmage, the irony was almost unbearable. He had once lost his life to a man whose bloodline had now decayed into this kind of pathetic trash. As the guests began leaving the estate, the mockery still did not come to an end. The sneers and whispered insults followed Cleanse even after the formal gathering had broken apart. Dalton, the purple-haired youth from the branch family, stepped directly into Cleanse's path and blocked his way. With a mocking look on his face, he began taunting him, asking how a supposedly highborn heir could be so useless that he did not even know how to swing a sword. The meddlesome branch family boy kept running his mouth, his voice growing louder with every insult. He branded Cleanse a disgrace to the Rhineland name, as if he had been waiting all day for the chance to say it. Cleanse remained calm on the surface, his expression barely changing. But as he looked at Dalton, he saw him exactly for what he was, a talentless busybody with no value worth acknowledging. When Dalton raised his fists in childish anger, Cleanse casually called him both naive and incredibly stupid. The insult struck Dalton's pride like a slap. Enraged, he stomped the ground with violent force, clearly preparing to attack. But before Dalton could do anything, Cleanse moved in a flash. The young heir swept Dalton's legs out from under him with clean precision, sending the loudmouthed boy crashing face first onto the hard stone floor. Blood began leaking from Dalton's nose as he lay there stunned, barely able to process what had just happened. Cleanse looked down at him and coldly advised him not to take out his frustrations on other people. But cornered by shame and desperation, Dalton screamed one final insult, calling the silver-haired boy a motherless bastard. The moment those words left Dalton's mouth, Cleanse slowly turned his head. His eyes ignited with a terrifying, predatory glow, burning with pure fury so intense that the air around him seemed to sharpen. Witnessing that dark, demonic shift in expression, the cowardly boy instantly locked up. His complexion turned deathly pale, and a fine mist of cold sweat broke out across his skin as he was paralyzed by genuine, heart-stopping terror. As he looked down at the cowering, trembling figure before him, the man, once a legendary villain, couldn't help but reflect on the true rot festering within this family. It was that arrogant, repulsive sense of superiority fueled by people exactly like Dalton. Deep within his veins, a spark of ancient, long-dormant magic began to stir. The Necromancer felt a weariness settle in. He wondered just how much longer he would be forced to play the charade of being a weakling. It was a bitter pill to swallow, watching firsthand just how far this once proud clan had fallen into decline. Cleanse's mind drifted back to the divine, blinding radiance of the hero who had finally struck him down in his past life. He couldn't help but feel a sharp, stinging sense of pity for the pathetic, degraded state of Burkle's descendants. His dark train of thought was abruptly shattered by the arrival of the commander. The knight's voice boomed down the length of the corridor, cutting through the tension as he sharply ordered the injured, tantrum-throwing Dalton to put an end to his embarrassing display. Standing with a posture as rigid and unyielding as forged iron, the knight leveled a glare at the scene. He made it perfectly clear through his stern presence that he would not tolerate such blatant, disrespectful behavior under his command for another second. Dalton gritted his teeth, a silent, impotent rage bubbling up inside him. Despite his bluster, He lacked the backbone and the sheer nerve to talk back to a warrior of the commander's undeniable caliber and experience. As he turned to retreat, he couldn't help but lob a final, biting remark over his shoulder. He spat at Cleanse, telling him that he should be groveling in gratitude for having such a formidable bodyguard to shield him. The pathetic loser hurried away with a ridiculous, stumbling gait, leaving the commander standing in the hall, staring after him with a look of utter bewilderment. With a heavy, practiced motion, the knight rested his hand firmly on the hilt of his sword. He turned his gaze toward Cleanse, offering a curt nod to reassure him that the immediate area was now secured and safe. The silver-haired boy observed his subordinate for a moment, his gaze distant and unreadable. He waited until the silence stretched thin before finally deciding to break it. He turned his eyes toward the knight and, with a voice devoid of any hesitation, simply asked if he had a spare sword that he would be willing to lend him. Later that night, the two figures ventured deep into the heart of a dense, dark forest. The ground beneath their feet seemed to vanish, swallowed whole by a thick, swirling mist that clung to the trees. Coming to a sudden halt, the great warrior reached out and passed a heavy, cold-forged steel blade directly into the boy's waiting hands. The commander frowned, casting a skeptical look at the boy as he questioned why his young master would require a lethal weapon at such a bizarre and late hour. Cleanse didn't answer. Instead, he stood in silence, his fingers tightening around the rough hilt as he settled into a combat stance that perfectly mimicked his brother's form. Watching this, the guard shook his head and began to turn back toward the mansion, quietly concluding that the boy was simply clinging to a delusional, hopeless dream of one day becoming a true swordsman. Deep down in his chest, the warrior felt a genuine, heavy surge of pity for the youth. He knew the harsh truth of this world. Without even a single drop of mana flowing through one's veins, all the training and effort in the world would ultimately be in vain. It was an immutable law that a person born without magical power could never, ever hope to ascend to the ranks of the Empire's knights. Oblivious to the guard's cynical thoughts, the boy began to whip the blade through the damp night air. He focused every ounce of his concentration on the training, driven by a burning desire to spite the supposed limitations of his body and master the family's forbidden arts. Closing his eyes, the former archmage reached into the depths of his mind, pulling up the memories of the dueling arena with sharp, crystalline clarity. He began to trace the air, perfectly replicating the incredibly complex footwork he had witnessed Delon execute just hours before. His body moved with a fluidity and precision that made a mockery of his young, inexperienced age. With a sudden, explosive leap, he synchronized his impulse with his movement, flawlessly mirroring the genius technique he had just observed. Abruptly, a volatile, dark purple aura began to coil and hiss around the razor-sharp edge of the steel blade. As he traced the sword's trajectory with terrifying, robotic perfection, those deep, ominous purple sparks began to crackle and pop intensely around his glowing eyes. He could feel a violent, chaotic shift in the very atmosphere surrounding him. The commander spun around, his breath hitching sharply in his throat. He froze mid-stride, utterly paralyzed by what he was seeing. He found himself completely unable to process or comprehend the sheer, overwhelming wave of raw power radiating from the boy, a boy he had dismissed as a dead weight only moments ago. In that singular, frozen heartbeat, the air rippled as Cleanse unleashed a colossal, jagged strike of pure purple energy, tearing through the darkness toward a massive, immovable boulder. However, just as the power reached its absolute peak, a sharp, piercing light flickered across the boy's pupils, suddenly disrupting and fracturing the flow of his immense, surging energy. The shadowy, crackling aura shattered instantly, dissolving into the freezing night wind like shards of broken glass. Despite the sudden interruption, the immense rock was sliced clean through the middle. The smooth, flat surface of the cut remained, glowing with a faint, residual light. The commander stood there, utterly speechless, his perception of reality crumbling to dust as he stared at the carnage. Cleanse slowly turned around, his grip on the heavy blade remaining firm and perfectly steady. A surprised, knowing smile curled across his lips. He realized that the ancient, formidable power he had once wielded in his past life was finally starting to answer his call once again. He had truly done it. He had replicated that god-tier technique with chilling, perfect accuracy. Nearby, the young maid, Erin, stood completely frozen in her tracks. Her jaw hung open in a state of absolute, hollow shock. She was simply unable to process the impossible feat she had just witnessed with her own eyes. The commander wasn't faring much better. A single bead of cold sweat tracked down his temple as he stared at the severed boulder. His mind was reeling from the terrifying realization that this boy, who supposedly lacked mana, was anything but helpless. The scene jumped forward to the next morning, where the young heir was found with his head plunged deep into a large bucket of water. The commander stood over him, offering a dry, mocking remark about the boy's ability to hold his breath for well over a minute, as Cleanse finally pulled his head out, gasping desperately for air. Cleanse had no choice but to endure the knight's relentless, dry humor regarding his bizarre morning aquarium rituals. He shouted back at the guard, who only let out a boisterous laugh in response, though the knight's eyes remained sharp, narrowing as he confessed that he had felt a distinctly sinister, heavy energy radiating from the young master's room earlier that morning. As the maid began to gently towel dry the silver-haired boy's damp locks, a servant stepped forward with a formal, stiff demeanor, clutching a sealed envelope. The messenger bowed and informed him that Dalton had personally sent an invitation. Cleanse blinked, his mind blanking on the name for a fleeting moment, until the servant reminded him of the apology that Dalton was supposedly desperate to offer. The former archmage recalled the pathetic, weak-willed punch the boy had tried to land on him and immediately let out a sharp, cynical scoff. He knew better than anyone that a spoiled, arrogant idiot like that wasn't looking for forgiveness. Gripping the heavy parchment, the silver-haired heir felt his suspicions begin to mount. As he scanned the contents, he discovered the invitation was for a hunting competition. A classic, transparent setup that practically screamed, "trap," from every word. It was painfully obvious that his enemy was just searching for a convenient excuse to lure him out into the dangerous wilderness, far away from the protective walls of the manor. When the messenger pressed him for a final response, Cleanse looked up with a sharp, calculating glint in his eyes and stated, calmly and firmly, that he saw no reason to refuse. He knew deep down that he held the ultimate advantage. As he cast a glance toward the sword leaning against the wall, he realized that the time he had spent obsessively studying his brother's movements had unlocked a terrifying new talent. He possessed the ability to copy any technique or ability with perfect clarity after witnessing it just a single time. The commander immediately moved to make arrangements for the carriage, preparing everything for the hunt that was about to begin. His expression stayed firm as he insisted that he would personally accompany Cleanse, making it clear that he had no intention of letting the young master travel into danger without protection. Even while making preparations, the commander kept glancing at Cleanse with a suspicious look in his eyes. After a moment, he finally asked what kind of scheme the young master was planning this time, as if he could already sense that this would not be an ordinary outing. Cleanse did not answer with a joke or an excuse. Instead, the silver-haired boy looked at him seriously and reminded the guard of the conversation they had shared before, especially the part about the strange changes taking place within his power. The knight's face tightened as he admitted that something felt different today. For some reason, the air itself seemed heavier than before, as if a dark and ominous pressure was following them. And with that uneasy feeling hanging over the group, the carriage began its rough journey toward the distant castle. The road ahead was anything but smooth. The carriage wheels struck uneven ground again and again, making the entire frame lurch violently as they pushed deeper into the woods and left the safer paths behind. Inside the cramped carriage, poor little Erin was already suffering. Her face had turned a sickly shade of green, and she clutched her stomach tightly as the constant shaking of the carriage slowly overwhelmed her with motion sickness. Before long, Erin could not even sit upright properly. She slumped weakly against the commander's side, barely able to keep herself steady, while he let out a tired sigh and muttered that he had warned her not to come along in the first place. Cleanse looked out through the carriage window at the dense layers of trees rushing past, then calmly explained that the forest floor had always been harsh on people who were not used to traveling through it. Only then did he offer Erin a pillow so she could rest more comfortably. The great warrior softened a little at the sight and encouraged the girl to sleep through the worst of it. In his eyes, the young master's gesture looked surprisingly considerate, and he seemed genuinely touched by what he mistook for Cleanse's gentle kindness. But Cleanse immediately cut through that warm misunderstanding. Without changing his expression, he bluntly clarified that the pillow was meant purely for Erin's comfort, not for the knight to enjoy or interpret however he pleased. After that, the white-haired boy fell into a quiet, thoughtful silence. He leaned near the window and stared out at the passing forest, his expression growing distant as the trees blurred beyond the carriage glass. His eyes followed the ancient woods as they stretched endlessly around the road. For a while, he simply watched in silence, thinking about how dramatically this world had changed over the past 2 centuries. 200 years ago, this very place had looked nothing like it did now. The forest that was currently lush, green, and full of life had once been a desolate land buried beneath heavy snow, weighed down by silence, death, and the lingering cold of countless corpses. The former villain gazed at the transformed land with a remote, contemplative look in his eyes. However grudging it may have been, a flicker of respect stirred inside him as he realized that Burkle had truly succeeded in changing this graveyard into a better world. That quiet reflection came to an end when a guard suddenly opened the carriage door from the outside. With a clear voice, he announced that they had arrived at the wide and imposing estate of the Cornwell family. Cleanse stepped down onto the gravel path and lifted his gaze toward the towering structure before him. For a moment, even he was slightly surprised, because the manor looked even more luxurious and extravagant than his own ducal residence. Looking over the lavish grounds and the ridiculous amount of wealth on display, Cleanse dryly remarked that for something as simple as a children's hunting competition, the hosts had certainly found an obscene amount of money to throw away. Then, without warning, a familiar and irritating voice cut sharply through the air from somewhere across the grounds, calling out Cleanse's name in a tone that was impossible to mistake. Dalton strode toward him with a smug look on his face, surrounded by a pack of lean, panting hunting dogs. As the animals tugged and breathed heavily beside him, he sneered at Cleanse and asked what the silver-haired trash was staring at. Dalton then bragged without the slightest shame that all this luxury had been built using wealth siphoned from Cleanse's own family. He punctuated the insult with an ugly, mocking laugh, clearly enjoying the chance to rub it in. Beside Dalton, one of the massive hounds lowered its head and released a deep, guttural growl. Thick strings of saliva hung from its jaws, dripping slowly toward the ground as its hungry eyes fixed forward. Cleanse glanced over the pack and quickly noticed something disturbing. The dogs were not simply fierce. They looked painfully thin. In a flat, unimpressed tone, he asked when the competition was actually going to begin. Dalton waved off his impatience with casual arrogance, as if Cleanse was too dull to understand what was about to happen. Then he told his rival to watch carefully, wearing a smile that made his cruelty obvious. With a deliberate show of malice, Dalton released the starving pack, letting the hungry dogs surge forward as part of his twisted demonstration. The ferocious hounds rushed into the woods, and Dalton explained with a pleased look that he had hidden bait all across the mountain to lure wild beasts into the hunting grounds. He bragged that a starving dog's sense of smell was 100,000 times sharper than a human's, as though the suffering of the animals only made his plan more impressive in his own eyes. As the hounds disappeared into the brush, Dalton raised his bow, his posture relaxed and confident, like he was preparing to show off a trick he had practiced many times before. The dogs sprinted forward with their jaws wide open, driven by nothing but hunger and primal desperation. Yet the moment they reached the bait, Dalton's arrows struck them down one after another, their pained yelps cutting through the forest while he laughed at his own twisted success. Erin's face filled with horror at the senseless violence unfolding in front of her. Unable to stay silent, the little girl stepped forward, trembling but determined, and tried to defend her master's honor. Dalton barely took her seriously. He looked down at her and recognized her as the little brat Cleanse always dragged around, his tone dripping with contempt. He reached a hand toward her as if he were merely going to pat her head, but his expression quickly twisted into something far more sinister. He asked what a useless girl like her could possibly offer, and in the next instant, he grabbed Erin's arm with brutal force, yanking her toward him hard enough to hurt. Before Dalton could go any further, Cleanse's hand shot out and locked around his wrist. His grip closed like a vice, stopping Dalton's movement completely. Cleanse's eyes flared with a cold, predatory fury as he stared straight at Dalton. In a voice that carried no hesitation, he warned him to take his hands off Erin immediately, or he would break his arm right there where he stood. Dalton's face flickered with shock when he felt the raw strength in Cleanse's grip. Panicking, he threw a desperate punch toward Cleanse's face, but Cleanse avoided it with a smooth, effortless tilt of his head. Dalton tried to sneer afterward, but it was obvious he was only trying to hide his fear. Rather than continue the confrontation there, Dalton suddenly leaped onto his horse. From the saddle, he challenged Cleanse to follow him deeper into the hunt, making the invitation sound more like a threat than a game. Cleanse mounted his own steed and ordered the commander to remain behind with Erin, telling him to protect her until he returned. But the knight refused to simply stand down. He held his ground and revealed a magic scroll tucked carefully into his belt. The commander explained that it was a signaling charm, a rare tool that could be activated simply by tearing it apart. Most importantly, it did not require any mana to use. That meant the moment danger appeared, the commander could call for help or move to Cleanse's aid without delay, even if magic itself could not be relied on. Cleanse gave a sharp nod of understanding. He knew Dalton's father was a suspicious man by nature, and if Dalton intended to vanish into the deep woods, then this was probably part of something far darker than an ordinary hunting game. The situation had already reached the edge of exploding. Before driving his horse forward, Cleanse looked back at the commander, and the weight in his gaze felt far too heavy for a normal teenage boy. He told the commander to tear the scroll the instant anything went wrong. Then, with chilling certainty, he assured the knight that if that happened, a great storm would rise in his hand. The strange promise left the warrior silent. He could only watch as Cleanse urged his horse onward and disappeared between the dark trunks, vanishing into the shadowed depths of the forest. Time slowly slipped away, and night eventually settled over the forest. Under the pale moonlight, the woods transformed into a maze of tangled branches, black tree trunks, and silver light stretching across the ground. As Cleanse rode deeper into the darkness, the former archmage calmly considered Dalton's movements. In his mind, his rival could not have hidden himself too far from the main path. At last, Cleanse broke through into a clearing and found Dalton waiting there. The purple-haired boy stood like a twisted silhouette against a horrifying scene, surrounded by a circle of slaughtered animals. With a sneer, he asked why the illustrious heir had taken so long to find him. Cleanse slowly dismounted from his horse, landing lightly on the ground. His eyes moved across the clearing, carefully taking in the strange and gruesome arrangement before him. The lifeless bodies of the hunting dogs lay scattered all around Dalton like grotesque decorations. Their blood soaked into the dark earth, turning the clearing into something that looked far more like a ritual site than the end of a hunt. Dalton rose to his feet with a manic glint shining in his eyes. His expression twisted with excitement as he declared that they had finally reached the grand finale of their competition. Then Dalton drew his sword, and the truth behind the hunt became clear. The animals had only been the beginning. From the start, Cleanse himself had been chosen as the final prey. Dalton openly threatened to slaughter him in the forest and then deliver the news of his tragic accident to his elder sister like a trophy, savoring every word as if the cruelty itself was part of his victory. Dalton sneered as he dragged the Rhineland family name through the dirt, mocking it as nothing more than an empty title, a ridiculous bloodline that had already lost all meaning. A cruel grin slowly spread across Dalton's face, and with one sharp motion of his hand, he gave the signal for the men hiding behind him to make their move. In the next instant, shadowy figures in hoods slipped out from between the trees like ghosts rising from the dark, each one raising a bow and locking their arrows straight onto the white-haired boy. They spat curses at him from the darkness, telling him that his only real mistake was being born with the wrong family name in the wrong era. But the silver-haired boy did not flinch at all. He simply stood there in the middle of the ambush, his expression calm and distant, as if the whole thing was too boring to even surprise him. Dalton's arrogance only grew as he kept running his mouth, bragging that by tomorrow morning, the entire continent would be whispering about how the legendary sword family had finally fallen, while its young master would be left behind as nothing but torn scraps for the beasts of the forest. Surrounded by enemies and standing on the edge of what should have been certain death, Cleanse suddenly found his thoughts drifting back to Burkle and those irritatingly noble words about protecting the future. A faint, mocking smile tugged at the corner of Cleanse's mouth, and that tiny reaction alone was enough to make Dalton's face twist with irritation and confusion. Then, in front of everyone, the boy suddenly began to laugh. It was not a nervous laugh or a child's laugh, but a deep, almost deranged cackle that rolled through the trees and made the night feel colder. That voice sounded far too old, far too heavy, to belong to such a small body. Dalton instinctively stepped back, his expression tightening as he demanded whether the silver-haired freak had finally gone insane. Cleanse lifted one hand to cover his face, but the laughter kept spilling through his fingers, as if the ugly irony of the situation was simply too pathetic for him to hold back. When he finally lowered his hand and looked up again, his eyes were no longer the eyes of a human child. A sharp blood-red glow burned within them, and when he spoke to Dalton as a cheeky brat, his voice carried an authority that made the air itself seem to bow. The purple-haired boy went completely stiff. Sweat poured down the side of his face, and deep in his soul, a terror older than reason began to take root. Cleanse's tone dropped into something cold and merciless as he reminded them that this family had been built upon the foundation of his own death, and he would never allow filthy insects like them to stain it with their mockery. A violent blue aura, dark and shadowy at its core, erupted from Cleanse's body in a sudden blast, rolling across the ground so fiercely that the earth beneath their feet began to tremble. Dalton screamed in panic, convinced that this had to be some kind of hidden magic. But Cleanse only smiled wickedly and corrected him, making it clear that what he was seeing was not magic at all. It was demonic energy in its purest form, the raw and terrifying essence left behind by the ancient necromancer who had once made the world tremble. The henchmen immediately lost their composure. Their hands shook around their weapons as they whispered in fear, finally wondering what sort of monster they had actually dared to surround. Suspended high above the ground by the force of his own darkness, Cleanse reached into the depths of forgotten history, calling to the ancient evil spirits buried beneath time and commanding them to rise once again. In his name, the dark energy twisted around him like living smoke, and the former archmage gave his creations a merciless order: devour everything that stood before them. From the deepest shadows, an enormous skeleton began to emerge, its massive frame towering over the battlefield as Cleanse ordered the creature to consume every enemy in its path. Dalton screamed so hard his voice nearly cracked, refusing to accept what his own eyes were seeing as he recognized the undead army spoken of in the old legends of Ashimon, the ancient demon king. With a cold, predatory smile on his lips, Cleanse raised one finger and pointed directly at his enemies, as if that single gesture had already sealed their deaths. In that moment, memories surged through him. He remembered how he had once believed he had forgotten the man he used to be, even after spending 200 agonizing years alone, buried within a mountain of bones and skulls. Those years had been an endless cycle of darkness, day after day with no warmth, no sky, and no sound except the constant echo of the dead calling to him from the bottom of the abyss. That haunting resonance had become a kind of nostalgia, something buried so deep inside him that no amount of time could ever truly erase it. It was the one sensation that anchored him to the truth, the reminder that forced him to remember who he really was beneath this borrowed face. Back in the present, the air around the clearing grew thick and suffocating. Massive dark clouds swallowed the moonlight overhead, while Dalton kept shrieking that none of this could be real, repeating the forbidden name of the archmage in pure terror. Cleanse merely smiled at him, calm and almost amused, confirming that yes, that was the very name the world had once trembled to hear. The henchmen, though frozen at first, began muttering among themselves in shaky voices, questioning whether the terrifying stories about the Demon King had really been nothing more than myths. They stared as the giant skeletons held their ground, and one by one, the empty sockets in their skulls ignited with fierce blood-red light that cut through the darkness like burning blades. But after that first wave of fear passed, the mercenaries slowly found their courage again, and their nervous murmurs turned into loud, mocking laughter. They sneered at the skeletons and called them worthless trash, boasting that they had smashed hundreds of undead creatures just like these during their past missions. One of them even laughed about dragging a bone back with him as a souvenir, treating the towering undead like nothing more than a trophy waiting to be claimed. Their leader barked for them to clear the way and eliminate the boy at the center of the storm. At once, one man stepped forward, lifting a massive heavy crossbow onto his shoulder and aiming it straight at the silver-haired youth. With a sharp command to fire, arrows and bolts burst into the air like a black rain, whistling through the night as they arched toward Cleanse and the undead legion standing behind him. The storm of projectiles closed in at deadly speed, their sharpened tips flashing in Cleanse's red eyes as they came rushing toward his body, ready to pierce through flesh and bone. But at the exact moment the first arrow should have struck him, the entire volley stopped dead in midair, frozen as if it had slammed into an invisible wall that could not be broken. Dalton immediately shouted in triumph, believing the barrage had turned the space around Cleanse into a forest of arrows and that the boy had finally been skewered. But that celebration lasted only a breath. As the dust and flying debris began to settle, Dalton's confident expression collapsed, and he stared in horror at Cleanse standing there without a single scratch on him. Huge spectral shields had appeared in front of the skeletons as if summoned from thin air, catching every arrow and bolt before they could touch their master. The army of the dead remained perfectly still, a silent wall of bone and dark power, ready to turn the hunters into prey. Now the skeletons stood even more imposing than before, each one armed with heavy shields that had formed to crush any further assault. Cleanse looked over his enemies with a gaze filled with both pity and disdain, saying that 200 years was more than enough time for the world to forget the true terror of his legions. The henchmen fell into panic all over again, their eyes widening as they watched those shields appear from nothing in the bony hands of the monsters before them. Cleanse spoke with chilling calm, making it clear that ordinary skeletons might indeed shatter easily, but the ones standing before them had been forged on an entirely different level. With a sharp, confident smile, he declared that his undead were nothing like the weak creatures they had fought before. That revelation, combined with the boy's absolute composure, pushed Dalton even deeper into paralyzing dread. Then Cleanse turned his attention toward the first unit of his undead army and gave them a cold command. He ordered them to break the enemy formation and advance, vowing that those who dared to mock the future of the North would be crushed by his own hands. With that final order, His troops surged forward in overwhelming force. The giant skeletons charged across the clearing with a speed that should have been impossible for bodies made of bone, catching the mercenaries completely unprepared. The enemies gasped in disbelief as the undead closed the distance, unable to understand how mindless piles of bone could move with such sharp, predatory agility. A bone-chilling, silent battle cry rippled through the air, vibrating deep within the minds of the living as Clean's army of the dead surged forward, plunging headlong into the fray with terrifying, relentless momentum. The mercenary leader roared, desperately screaming for his men to hold their ground and suppress the rising tide of panic, but his commands were completely swallowed up by the cacophony of metal clashing against bone and the visceral sounds of impending violence. Before the leader could even blink, one of his own subordinates was brutally slammed by a skeleton, his frame snapping under the unnatural force as he was sent flying through the air like a discarded ragdoll. The systematic massacre began in earnest, turning the once silent woods into a chaotic theater of horrors filled with the blood-curdling screams of dying men and the rhythmic, hollow clatter of skeletal soldiers advancing. Dalton stood rooted to the spot, watching with wide-eyed horror as the battlefield rapidly transformed into a gruesome slaughterhouse of his own making, his plans dissolving into a nightmare of carnage. Without missing a single beat, the young mage calmly turned his attention to his second unit, ordering his skeletal crossbowmen to sweep the area and methodically eliminate any stragglers attempting to flee the slaughter. High above in the gnarled, twisting branches of the surrounding trees, skeletal archers shifted into tactical positions, their empty, hollow eye sockets locking onto their prey with a predatory and unnatural precision. The few surviving mercenaries felt their blood run stone cold as they realized with sickening clarity that the undead weren't just melee monsters. They possessed lethal, long-range capabilities that left nowhere to hide. With a short, dry, and utterly chilling command, the former archmage signaled his forces to unleash their projectiles without a shred of mercy. A massive, lethal volley of arrows whistled through the thick, dark air, flying at such incredible, unnatural speeds that the mercenaries barely had time to register the sound before impact. The mercenaries were cut down exactly where they stood, the sheer, crushing force of the enchanted bolts pinning their bodies firmly to the earth as they shrieked in uncontrollable agony. One particularly resilient mercenary leader refused to go down quietly, desperately raising his sword to deflect the bone-shattering blow of an incoming skeleton. He shouted into the darkness, his voice cracking with desperation as he insisted that this was impossible, swearing that no mere, lowly necromancer could ever command such terrifyingly coordinated power. As he parried another strike, the terrifying realization hit him. If the battle continued at this relentless pace, every single one of them was destined to be utterly and completely annihilated. Dalton watched his carefully laid plans crumble into dust, screaming for his men to listen to his orders, but his frantic voice was utterly lost within the deafening chaos of the surrounding carnage. A skeleton silently crept up from the shadows behind him, its jagged, rusted blade already raised high, poised and ready to deliver a final, lethal blow to the noble's back. Snarling in a blind fit of panicked rage, the purple-haired noble spun around on his heel and delivered a precise, lightning-fast strike that successfully severed the creature's skull from its spine. For a single, fleeting second, he allowed himself a moment of grim celebration, convinced that he had finally discovered the fatal weakness of these monsters by targeting their heads. However, his brief spark of triumph turned to freezing ash in his mouth as the headless, hulking skeleton refused to fall, its body remaining upright and steady. Instead of collapsing, it continued its relentless advance, swinging its heavy weapon back at him with a terrifying, unrelenting force that forced Dalton to scramble backward. Dalton recoiled in absolute terror, finally realizing that the fundamental laws of life and death he had studied simply did not apply to these puppets of the Archmage. The villain stood frozen in a state of total, paralyzed disbelief, his mind reeling as he struggled to process how a common, reanimated skeleton could continue to function without its skull. Cleanse looked on with a slow, chilling, and mocking smile, reminding the noble that he had already been warned about the true nature of his power. As the headless monster stood back up to its full height, it reached down with chilling efficiency, calmly retrieved its own rolling skull from the dirt, and snapped it back onto its neck as if it were nothing more than adjusting a piece of misaligned armor. Cleanse explained that this terrifying, unyielding resilience was the primary reason he had been able to sweep across the entire continent in his past life. The sight of the creature casually repairing its own severed head with its own hands sent Dalton spiraling into a state of deep primal terror. With a cold, detached tone, the former Archmage began to reveal the dark, hidden truth behind his army. He explained that spirits summoned with such pure, concentrated demonic energy do not abide by the fragile laws of mortal injury. They simply do not die with the ease of living men. The surviving mercenaries were pushed completely past the brink of sanity, wailing in utter, hollow despair as they realized they were fighting a hopeless war against an army that flat-out refused to stay down. Cleanse let out a soft, dismissive sigh, noting that with his current, physically limited youthful body, he could only maintain 11 of these elite summons at once, before turning his gaze toward the trembling men to ask if they truly wished to continue this ridiculous farce. While the forest was being painted in a gruesome palette of blood, the perspective shifted abruptly back to the peaceful, sun-drenched gardens of the mansion, where the commander and the little maid, Erin, were sharing a carefree laugh by the decorative fountain. Erin giggled uncontrollably, her imagination running wild as she listened to the stories of the young master's supposed, comical misbehavior during his time at the monastery. The commander watched her with a noticeably softened expression, observing the genuine, heart-warming adoration she clearly held for the young boy. She sat there happily, her cheeks comically stuffed to the brim with sweet treats. She nodded with contagious enthusiasm, declaring that she loved the young master more than anything in the entire world, and she pressed the knight to confirm if he truly understood just how incredible the young master was, describing him as the absolute personification of kindness. Her sweet, innocent words created a haunting, jarring contrast to the reality unfolding elsewhere. Even as she sang his praises as a gentle soul, a mercenary was currently sprinting blindly through the dark, suffocating woods, shrieking in absolute, unadulterated fear. Even as she called him sweet, a skeletal warrior was currently cleaving through a terrified henchman with a jagged blade glowing with dark, forbidden magic. She smiled with a bright, genuine radiance, claiming he was the warmest soul in the whole world, simply because he was kind enough to share his biscuits with her. While at that very same moment, a cold, oppressive, and shadowy aura of death was actively suffocating the life out of everything moving within the forest. Back in the thick of the gruesome carnage, the protagonist's gaze remained as cold as chips of solid ice, completely devoid of the warmth that Erin so fondly and naively described. One of the last remaining mercenaries let out a final, gurgling cry as a skeleton efficiently ended his life, leaving only the purple-haired Dalton standing alone to defend himself against the onslaught. He was panting heavily, his muscles burning with raw exhaustion as he swung his blade in a frantic, desperate arc. He managed to land one final, heavy blow, but the skeleton's bones simply knit themselves back together in an instant. The sight left him in a state of utter, overwhelming hopelessness. In a sudden, explosive fit of desperate rage, Dalton realized that hacking away at these mindless puppets was nothing more than a fool's errand, and he concluded that the only possible way to end this nightmare was to eliminate the puppeteer himself. He reasoned that if he could only manage to strike down the young master, the entire army of summons would surely vanish into thin air. With a raw, guttural roar of pure hatred, Dalton abandoned all caution and charged directly toward Cleanse, screaming his name into the chaotic wind. He declared with burning intensity that this macabre game of playing with corpses was over, and that everything would be settled once and for all by the mage's imminent death. He raised his sword high for a final, overhead executioner strike, pouring every last ounce of his remaining strength and resolve into the lethal blow, yet Cleanse didn't even flinch. His eyes suddenly ignited with a brilliant, piercing purple light, his heightened magical sight predicting the exact trajectory of the incoming attack with crystalline, unerring clarity. To the ancient, experienced necromancer, the mercenary's deadly lunge was moving in agonizingly slow motion, a pathetic, misguided attempt from a mere child who clearly didn't yet understand that he was foolishly challenging a literal god of the afterlife. Violent purple energy crackled intensely within Cleanse's eyes, the sharp, flickering sparks illuminating the surrounding darkness as he tracked every single micro-movement of his opponent through his powerful mystical sight. The vast, ancient archives of his memory swung open, pulling forth a specific technique he had witnessed only once before. He recalled with absolute, photographic precision the exact trajectory and the distinct rhythm of the swordplay his brother had displayed in the arena just days ago. Dalton's eyes widened in paralyzing, bone-deep shock as he recognized that Cleanse was perfectly mirroring the stance. Drawing upon the long-hidden, sacred techniques of the Rhineland family, Cleanse moved with lethal grace. He unleashed a devastating meteor sword strike. His blade ignited, transforming into a searing streak of falling light that slammed directly into Dalton's defenses with earth-shattering force. The sound was jarring, a sickening, high-pitched metallic snap that echoed through the clearing. Dalton's sword was utterly shattered, sheared clean in half, and the jagged, broken steel spiraled through the air before embedding itself deep into the churned-up dirt. Cleanse loomed over his opponent, who lay trembling and exposed on the ground. The young mage's voice dropped to a low, glacial whisper, cutting through the silence as he informed Dalton that his true, agonizing punishment had only just begun. As the dust kicked up from their skirmish slowly settled and the night air grew unnervingly still, Cleanse looked down at the defeated noble. He conceded, with a cold edge to his tone, that Dalton had been right about one critical thing. If a summoner is killed, all of his creations instantly lose their life force and crumble into nothingness. Even the legendary Ashimon, in all his dark power, had never managed to find a way to overcome that fundamental, crippling flaw. However, as the former Archmage stood amidst the ruins of the fight, he began to reflect on a new, bitter irony that had defined his current existence. While his past self had relied exclusively on the volatile nature of demonic energy, it was the raw, physical martial prowess of the Rhineland bloodline that now fortified his previous weaknesses. The very blood of his ancient, hated enemy was now coursing through his own veins, and this strange fusion had forged him into something far more dangerous and formidable than he had ever been in his former life. Dalton, his body broken and his mind spiraling into confusion, stammered out a desperate question. He tried to force his limbs to obey him, but they remained unresponsive, heavy as lead, anchoring him firmly to the earth. Cleanse met the boy's frantic gaze with a look of absolute, chilling indifference and supreme contempt. He simply watched, unmoved, as the last flicker of life began to fade from Dalton's eyes. With one final, shuddering breath, Dalton collapsed, his body finally going still. Cleanse turned his attention toward the dark horizon and whispered a promise to the spirit of Burkle. He told the ghost to wait, for he fully intended to restore this ruined, fallen house back to its former glory with his own two hands. Suddenly, Dalton jolted awake with a start, but the forest was gone. He found himself plunged into a disorienting, suffocating void of absolute darkness, gasping for air in the emptiness. He tried to thrash and move his arms, but his wrists were locked firmly in place by the freezing, biting weight of thick, iron shackles. Panic surged through his chest like wildfire as the darkness cleared just enough to reveal his situation. He was strapped into a brutal torture chair, its frame studded with cruel iron spikes and heavy, rusted chains. A shadowy silhouette began to manifest from the void. A voice, dry, calm, and utterly detached, remarked that their guest had finally managed to wake up. It was Cleanse, though his presence here felt different, as if he were empowered by this space. He explained that they had been dragged into a pocket dimension, an afterlife of his own design, crafted by the lingering will of Ashimon, where souls go once their light is extinguished. Dalton's sanity fractured as the terrifying reality took hold. He was dead, imprisoned in a nightmare realm built by the Necromancer. Cleanse leaned forward, his presence looming large as his voice echoed with the heavy, ancient weight of centuries. He coldly reminded Dalton of his favorite hobby, the countless innocent dogs he had heartlessly starved, tortured, and slaughtered. He listed the atrocities the noble had committed for the sheer, twisted thrill of sport, all while hiding behind the veneer of high-born tradition. The mage vividly recalled the look of perverted joy that had spread across Dalton's face during those cruel hunts, a memory he had now turned into the perfect blueprint for the villain's own eternal suffering. Dalton let out a piercing shriek, begging and demanding to be released, but his desperate cries were quickly swallowed up by the uncaring abyss. For a brief, agonizing moment, a glimmer of clarity broke through the villain's hysteria. He clearly remembered the sensation of Cleanse's blade piercing his heart in the physical world. Yet here he sat, seemingly whole and untouched. Cleanse stepped forward to clarify the nature of this nightmare. Dalton was undeniably dead, and this state of being was simply a vessel for his karmic retribution. Whether the boy believed in the afterlife or the nature of his soul was entirely irrelevant now. The debt was finally due. The time had come for him to pay in full for every single drop of blood he had ever spilled. The ghosts of his past sins had arrived to collect on what he owed. Dalton's breathing turned into a ragged, pathetic sob as a phantom pack of hellhounds materialized from the shadows behind him. Cleanse commanded his enemy to listen, really listen. He told him to pay attention to the haunting cacophony of barks and snarls, the echoes of all the lives he had snuffed out without a second thought. The ghost dogs lunged at his command, their spectral jaws snapping shut and sinking deep into the villain's soul, fueled by his own past malice. Dalton screamed in a despair so profound it felt as if his very essence was being torn to shreds by invisible teeth. The silver-haired boy stood over him, cold and utterly unyielding, instructing him to memorize every second of this agony. For this was the hell he had constructed with his own cruel hands. Dalton's desperate pleas for mercy fell on deaf ears. He was left to be ravaged by the very victims of his own gruesome blood sport. Back in the physical world, Dalton's limp, lifeless body lay sprawled in the dirt, covered in deep, jagged wounds that perfectly mirrored the spiritual assault he was suffering in the beyond. Cleanse sheathed his blade with a serene expression, finally having purged the pathetic nuisance who had dared to stand against him. His skeletal legion gathered behind him, standing in silent, perfectly loyal rows. As he looked upon the hollow, glowing sockets of his undead servants, the young mage felt the prick of an ancient, lingering debt. He spoke to his creatures, telling them they had earned a reward for answering his call across the span of centuries, and promised to finally shatter the curse of their eternal servitude. A brilliant, pulsing emerald light washed over the clearing, and the skeletons began to dissolve, breaking down into shimmering, floating particles of mana. Cleanse watched in heavy, contemplative silence as they faded into the evening wind, reflecting deeply on the endless, cyclical nature of existence. Once again, the question nagged at him. Why had he been pulled back from the void to walk the earth? In his personal philosophy, true death was simply when the bones turned to dust and were scattered to the winds without a trace. Yet here he stood, alive in flesh and blood once more. His internal musings were abruptly cut short when a cloaked, hooded figure emerged from the tree line, expressing genuine surprise at seeing someone so young capable of wielding the forbidden art of necromancy. Cleanse's eyes narrowed, his posture tensing as he coldly questioned the stranger's identity and demanded to know how much of his work he had witnessed. The man offered a cryptic, mocking smile, dismissively stating that there was no need for them to exchange names. With a casual flick of his wrist, a sickly green aura flared in the stranger's palm, and he began to weave a spell of his own. He warned the boy that he wouldn't grasp the scope of his mission, even if he tried to explain it. Before Cleanse could even react, the dead mercenaries scattered across the ground began to twitch, their limbs jerking as they rose to their feet. Their eyes flickered open, glowing with a stagnant, unnatural green light, turning them into mindless, twitching marionettes under the stranger's absolute control. The hooded man gestured, hoisting the corpses into the air with his dark magic, noting that while Dalton had been a pathetic failure, his leftovers still possessed some utility. With one final, chilling laugh that hung in the air, the necromancer vanished into the gathering mist. He took the reanimated bodies with him, leaving Cleanse behind. Meanwhile, miles away at the mansion, the peaceful atmosphere had begun to sour, tainted by a new, creeping dread. Erin, the little maid, kept trying her best to draw the commander back into the conversation, gently coaxing him to hear just a few more stories about the young master's usual mischief and reckless little adventures. But the commander's expression remained frozen in place. His eyes stayed locked on the emergency scroll gripped tightly in his hand, and with every passing second, the unease in his chest grew heavier and darker. No matter how hard he tried to calm himself, he couldn't shake the terrible feeling that something had already gone horribly, irreversibly wrong. 3 full hours had passed since the signal first began to feel strange, and now every instinct in his body was roaring the same warning at him. This was not an accident. It smelled like a trap. He immediately turned to leave the estate and search for Cleanse himself, but before he could take another step, 2 stern castle guards moved into his path. Their grim faces made the air tighten in an instant, and the commander finally understood that the plot against the young heir reached far deeper than a simple hunting trip gone wrong. The guards stationed at the mansion blocked his way without the slightest change in expression. In a cold, formal tone, they warned him that if the commander abandoned his post at a time like this, it would create a very serious problem. The knight fell into a heavy silence. His gaze slowly sharpened, narrowing as he studied the mark displayed on their uniforms and recognized the crest of Cornwall. That family emblem, boldly stamped across their clothing, told him everything he needed to know. Dalton's family had been laying this web of betrayal from the very beginning, and they had clearly prepared for the worst outcome. The commander straightened his back and rose to his full imposing height, his presence suddenly pressing down on the guards as he gave them one final warning. If they dared to stand in his way again, he made it clear that he would no longer remain still and let them stop him. The killing intent rolling off him was so overwhelming that even the Cornwall guards, who had been so rigid moments before, faltered and hesitated. The knight then turned sharply toward Erin, the young maid, and ordered her to return to the manor at once, telling her to stay close to the priest who had come with them on the trip. But one of the guards, his face still grim, informed him that the priest had already left a long time ago. In that instant, Cleanse's earlier warnings flashed through the commander's mind, and feeling the urgency closing around him, he vaulted onto his horse without another word. With the emergency scroll clenched firmly between his teeth, he ripped it apart, his eyes hard with certainty. None of this was coincidence. Every piece had been arranged too cleanly. He drove his heels into his horse's sides and sent the animal thundering forward, racing toward the forest as fast as it could carry him, terrified of what might have already happened to his master. Far deeper inside the dark forest, the young protagonist stood alone, holding his ground against the mysterious necromancer and the legion of walking dead surrounding him. Cold beads of sweat slid down his pale face as he realized just how badly the previous battle had drained him. Almost all of his demonic energy had already been used up. This young body of his had finally reached its limit, and in his current state, he could no longer rely on his own necromancy to protect himself. Sensing that victory was now within reach, the hooded sorcerer gave the order without mercy, commanding his mindless zombies to rush the boy all at once. The undead horde surged forward with outstretched arms and twisted jaws, yet Cleanse only raised a faint smirk, openly mocking the necromancer in front of him. He sneered at the man for believing that simply copying the arts of the past would ever be enough to defeat him. Then, without warning, the crest engraved on the magic scroll in Cleanse's hand burst open with a blinding celestial glow, flooding the darkness with radiant light. The zombies closing in on him shrieked and staggered backward, their rotten bodies twisted in agony as the holy radiance burned through the gloom and seared into their flesh. Cleanse laughed at the sight, his confidence returning as he taunted his enemy, and declared that the necromancer was completely finished now. While the necromancer stared in confusion, the ground beneath them began to throb with golden divine power, waves of light surging upward and swallowing the surrounding shadows. From the very center of that brilliant radiance, the priest who had been traveling with the young heir stepped into view, his eyes blazing with fierce golden fire. His voice rang out like rolling thunder as he called upon the light to purify the abominations before him, and in moments, the zombies were burned down into nothing but drifting ash. He then calmly assured the young master that he could finally breathe easy, because from this point on, the church would take care of everything. The necromancer, stunned by the overwhelming holy power before him, demanded to know who this newcomer was and how he could wield such terrifying force. The priest met the necromancer's gaze without flinching, his expression filled with absolute resolve, and revealed himself as an exarch of the Holy Order. An exarch was no ordinary servant of the church. They were the church's supreme human weapons, 3 chosen warriors sworn to carry out the absolute will of the Pope himself. Only they could wield the sacred weapons left behind by Saint Galagund, and among the faithful, it was said that a single exarch possessed the fighting strength of an entire fortress. The necromancer began to tremble as the priest's holy aura expanded around him, physically crushing and tearing apart the darkness he had summoned. Cleanse watched in silence as the man he had known only as a simple priest revealed his true identity, the strongest martial warrior among the 3 chosen exarchs. The exarch stepped forward and placed himself between the boy and the enemy, standing like an unbreakable shield as he vowed to protect him from every evil before them. The remaining zombies, whipped into motion by the necromancer's desperate commands, snarled and threw themselves forward with savage fury, but their charge was useless before that divine light. The exarch raised a sacred tome, pouring his power into a blazing baptism of fire that engulfed the undead and incinerated them where they stood. With a voice heavy with judgment, he commanded the sinners before him to listen, pray, and prepare their souls. Before it was too late, his words fell like a final sentence. Then he stomped the ground with tremendous force, sending a golden shockwave rippling through the earth. The ground cracked apart as the blast hurled the undead puppets away like leaves caught in a violent storm, crushing them with one decisive blow. The exarch declared that this was his mercy, a final judgment granted to souls that had already been lost and corrupted. The necromancer himself was blown back by the sheer pressure of the attack, his thoughts spinning in disbelief at the madness of an exarch appearing in such a remote place. He cursed bitterly into the wind, realizing that his carefully prepared plan had slammed straight into the most terrifying force the Holy Order could possibly send. The hooded necromancer spat toward the ground, his voice shaking and cracking as he raged that this so-called divine power was nothing but an enormous lie. Overcome by fear, he suddenly turned away from the clearing and tried to flee with everything he had. But in the panic of his escape, his mask loosened and slipped from his face, dropping onto the forest floor and exposing his hidden identity beneath the moonlight. He did not make it far. The exarch appeared directly in his path like a wrathful god descending from judgment, his voice terrifyingly calm as he asked where the necromancer thought he was going. The man screamed as the priest's mental pressure forced its way into his mind, crushing his will and leaving him gasping for air that would not come. The sorcerer could only listen as the priest whispered that the prayer was not finished yet, and that he should be grateful for the judgment the divine light was about to grant him. Then, in the name of the Holy Order, the Exarch brought down one final purifying strike, and the Necromancer's body collapsed into nothing more than a pile of gray ash. Cleanse stood there in silence, watching the execution unfold with intense focus. Then his gaze dropped as one of the Necromancer's eyes rolled across the dirt, leaving a faint trail behind it before finally stopping right at his feet. As Cleanse bent down and reached for it, his mind replayed the Exarch's terrifying display of power. With nothing more than a single step and the pressure pouring from his presence, that priest had wiped out more than 20 bodies in an instant. Even Cleanse, who had once stood at the peak as an archmage, couldn't help feeling deeply impressed by the overwhelming scale of that strength. But before he could fully collect his thoughts, a blood-stained hand suddenly clamped down on his shoulder with enough force to bruise. Cleanse froze, realizing at once that it was the Exarch. The man's eyes narrowed sharply as he looked Cleanse over from head to toe, as if trying to see through every secret hidden beneath that young body. The Exarch said he had rushed to this place the moment he sensed a powerful surge of necromancy rising from the forest. But now that he was standing here in person, something felt terribly wrong. His fingers tightened on Cleanse's shoulder as he noted that the aura of death he had detected did not quite seem to belong to the boy. That deadly presence had definitely come from this exact spot. The Exarch's gaze grew colder and sharper, and Cleanse felt tension wash over him like ice water. He knew, without a doubt, that he was standing on the very edge of a cliff. One careless movement, one wrong answer, even one suspicious hesitation, and this holy man would erase him on the spot without the slightest mercy. But before the pressure could crush him completely, the standoff shattered beneath the sound of thundering hooves as the commander came charging in. The commander shouted Cleanse's name in alarm, his voice cutting through the forest with raw panic. Seeing his own guard arrive so quickly brought a small flicker of relief to Cleanse's tense face. But the terrible strain of the night had finally caught up with him, and the cost of drawing out even a tiny portion of his old power was now pressing down on his body. For his current fragile body, even that limited use of necromancy had been far too much to bear. His legs suddenly gave out beneath him, and the world tilted sideways. The commander sprang down from his horse at once, rushing forward and catching his young master before he could collapse onto the ground. With desperation written across his face, the knight asked what had happened. Cleanse could only whisper weakly that all of his strength had simply disappeared. When the commander asked about the hunting party, Cleanse answered in a cold, steady voice that Dalton had been eliminated during the fight. Not far away, a lone white flower swayed quietly in the dark forest wind, its delicate petals stained with small drops of crimson blood. The setting then returned to the mansion, where a fierce inquiry was already raging inside the room. The news of Dalton's death had struck the gathering like a bolt of lightning, and Count Delkin Cornwell, Dalton's father, slammed both fists onto the table in a storm of blind rage. He refused to accept that his son, a man he insisted was honorable, loyal, and worthy of a knight's name, would ever attempt to assassinate the ducal heir. An investigator stepped in and calmly presented a document, showing the Count clear proof that 20 of his own mercenaries had been present at the scene. The Count's face drained of color when he realized his men had been exposed, but he quickly forced himself to recover and shifted to another argument. He insisted that the story made no sense. Dalton was a trained warrior, while everyone knew Cleanse had no mana at all and could barely defend himself. Desperate to protect his family's reputation, the Count began attacking Cleanse himself, dragging out the strange and ugly rumors that had surrounded the boy's late mother. He accused Cleanse of hiring an assassin to murder Dalton, then turning around and framing his son for the crime. Just as the Count's accusations rose to a furious peak, a powerful voice rang out from the entrance, commanding him to shut his mouth. Cleanse stepped into the room, his expression calm but edged with a dry smirk, remarking that there truly seemed to be no limit to the nonsense these men could say. He stated plainly that he had acted in self-defense, and that the priest had aided him when the real threat, the Necromancer, appeared. When the Count called him a liar, Cleanse met his gaze without backing down. A faint mocking pink light flickered in his eyes, and with a thin, ironic smile, he asked whether they had already decided that he was Ashimon. A suffocating pressure suddenly closed around the Count as Cleanse reminded everyone present of the vow he had made the moment Dalton died. It was a solemn oath to rebuild the crumbling foundation of the Rhineland family with his own hands. His voice carried a chilling certainty as he declared that he would restore the family himself, and that no more vermin would be allowed to block his path. The oppressive tension filling the room was suddenly broken by a sharp knock at the door. A blonde woman entered with a presence so commanding that the atmosphere seemed to freeze the moment she stepped inside. She was the commander of the Blue Spear Holy Knights, and her arrival immediately sent a quiet ripple of unease through everyone gathered there. Cleanse recognized her at once. She was the same woman who had been present at the sword exhibition, watching everything from the shadows. When one noble questioned what right she had to appear in this inquiry, the investigator explained that Dalton had long carried out missions for her order, giving her a clear interest in uncovering the truth. She fixed her piercing, analytical gaze directly on Cleanse, and even the ancient mage hidden within him instinctively became wary under that stare. Without wasting a single moment on pleasantries, the commander requested a private audience with the young master. The investigator hesitated for a moment, clearly uneasy about the request, but in the end, he allowed it and warned Cleanse not to take too long. As Cleanse followed her toward a more secluded room, his thoughts began moving quickly, weighing one possibility after another. He knew this meeting was not some polite social visit. It was either a cautious confirmation of suspicion, or a dangerous test waiting to unfold. Still, no matter what her true purpose was, Cleanse silently resolved to use her family, the House of Forivern, as a stepping stone for the greater plans he intended to build. They soon reached a private study, and the commander turned toward him. Her calm, strangely alluring voice broke through the quiet air between them. Then, without any warning, she pressed Cleanse back against the wall, locking her eyes onto his as she whispered a request he never expected. She wanted to touch him because that was how she intended to see the truth. This woman was the eldest daughter of the Forivern House, one of the 3 legendary pillars that supported the continent. Cleanse immediately recalled the fearsome reputation attached to her name. The record spoke of her battles against savage orcs, where her blue eyes would glow with lethal intensity as she moved through the chaos with her spear like a dancer of war. She was a living legend, a warrior who had single-handedly wiped out high-level monster orders and stood alone among mountains of corpses as the undisputed protector of civilians. Back in the present, that heavy pressure around her had not faded at all. Even while she toyed with him in that teasing tone, the air around her still felt sharp enough to make Cleanse tense instinctively. When Cleanse paused instead of answering right away, her expression hardened in an instant. She cut him off coldly, snapping that he should stop acting as if the two of them were somehow close. Then she reminded him of where they truly stood. Yes, their families were connected in name, but she was the daughter of the first wife, while he came from another branch entirely. There was no real blood bond between them, and because of that, she had no reason to restrain her own curiosity for the sake of family affection. Before Cleanse could properly respond, the commander drove him back against the wall again. Her hand pinned him firmly in place, and with an unyielding stare, she ordered him to show her his hands. Cleanse shouted back in total confusion, demanding to know what she thought she was doing. But his protest did nothing to slow her down, and she ignored him as if his words were nothing more than background noise. She reached down and took his hand into her own, her grip gentle enough not to hurt him, yet firm enough that he could not easily pull away. Then her fingertips began to press over his skin with careful, deliberate attention. After feeling his palm for only a moment, she spoke with a faint, almost amused certainty. His hands were soft, almost like a baby's, with none of the rough calluses, hardened skin, or old scars that would belong to someone who had lived by the sword. Her fingers traced along the lines of his tendons with the precision of someone examining evidence. Then she leaned in closer, so close that Cleanse could feel the warmth of her breath brushing against his face. Her eyes locked directly onto his, sharp and unwavering, and in that suffocating silence, she finally asked the question that mattered most. If those hands had never truly been shaped by sword training, then what kind of power had he used to butcher Dalton and 20 battle-hardened mercenaries? Cleanse reacted on instinct, shoving her away from him and stumbling back several steps. A chill spread along the back of his neck as cold sweat began to gather there. At that moment, he understood something very clearly. This woman was far more dangerous than the priests he had dealt with before. She was not trying to force a confession out of him. She was watching for the smallest crack in his reaction. In her world, silence could be treated as admission, and even a heartbeat of hesitation could become proof. So Cleanse chose to strike back first. He lifted the corner of his mouth into a mocking smile and asked her straight out what she would do if he really was the legendary Archmage Ashimon. To his complete and utter shock, she did not freeze, panic, or even look impressed. Instead, she suddenly burst into laughter. She looked him over from head to toe, her gaze openly dismissive, and told him that a tiny little pipsqueak like him could never be the terrifying demon king from the old legends. That single insult struck Cleanse with more force than any punch or blade ever could. He stood there stunned, his mouth slightly open, unable to process what he had just heard. He repeated the word pipsqueak under his breath in disbelief, as if the idea itself was impossible. He, the most feared necromancer in history, had just been mocked for being short. He asked whether she might have made some kind of mistake, but the grin on her face did not change at all. She confirmed it without the slightest hesitation, even offering to say it again if he had failed to hear her properly. Then, with that same merciless smile, she called him a pipsqueak once more, and Cleanse felt his temper flare from the sheer humiliation of it. Deep down, the worst part was that he knew her judgment about his height was not entirely wrong. But that did not make it hurt any less. His pride as the former Demon King took a direct hit, and before he could recover from the damage, the commander suddenly threw out an offer so bold and absurd that the entire situation became even stranger. She told him that if he could defeat a knight without relying on a sword or using his necromancy, then she would give him a kiss. Cleanse went completely silent. For a moment, his thoughts stalled, unable to keep up with the ridiculous confidence and audacity behind her proposal. With his body still suffering from internal injuries and the conversation growing more surreal by the second, he found it increasingly difficult to judge the situation with a clear head. He wondered whether this was some twisted political tactic, a trap, or perhaps the strangest form of bribery he had ever encountered. Meanwhile, she turned her gaze toward the horizon and casually noted that the hour was growing late, so she needed to return to the meeting. Then, almost as if leaving him with one final provocation, she added that the legendary Archmage would never have been as reckless or as daring as the boy standing in front of her. When they stepped back into the meeting hall, the atmosphere shifted at once. Every gaze in the room swung toward them, burning with curiosity over what had happened while they were gone. Cleanse silently admitted that he had allowed himself to become far too careless. He had underestimated just how deep and filthy the political swamp he had stepped into truly was. He understood that the nobles in that room would never honestly accept the idea that a powerless boy had merely defended himself against the Count's son. When the investigator pressed him for details about the private conversation, Cleanse gave no answer at all. Instead, he walked straight toward a sword resting against the wall, seized the hilt, and drove the blade down into the floor with a violent thud. The sudden impact cracked through the room like thunder, instantly forcing every shocked noble to look his way. The entire assembly fell silent, watching without a sound as the boy slowly turned and faced Count Delkin Cornwell. Then Cleanse challenged the Count directly. If Delkin believed his accusations were true, then he could prove them right there and settle the matter of Cleanse's innocence once and for all. Cleanse invoked the old northern custom of trial by combat, a ruthless duel with no neat courtroom arguments or safe restrictions, where the winner would be declared innocent and the loser would be branded guilty. Count Delkin Cornwell stared at him in stunned disbelief, as if he were wondering whether the boy had finally gone completely insane. After all, trial by combat was a savage relic from an older age, a brutal tradition where almost anything could happen once the duel began. But the Count's shock did not last long. Very quickly, he recognized the opportunity hidden inside Cleanse's challenge. If he could drag this dispute out of the courtroom and into the arena, then he could bury every trace of his mercenaries along with the troublesome boy himself. So Count Delkin Cornwell accepted with a smile that looked more like a predator baring its teeth. He announced that he would appoint a champion to fight in his place, and swore that this duel would end with Cleanse's death. Cleanse did not flinch. He simply smiled back, calm and unbothered, and declared that he would be the one to bring the Count's bloodline to an end. With the duel now set for 4 days later, Cleanse knew this confrontation was only the opening move. He planned to use the Count as his first stepping stone, to show every bastard in the family exactly who he was. In his mind, he would tear that house down from its foundations and rebuild it in his own image. Elsewhere, inside a private wing of the mansion, Cleanse's older half-brother Delon exploded with fury the moment he heard what had happened. Delon shouted that the challenge was absolute madness, his voice shaking with anger and fear. He demanded to know whether Cleanse truly understood that he had just gambled with his own life. Cleanse, already worn down from being lectured again and again, answered with clear exhaustion. He told Delon that he knew perfectly well what he had done and was tired of hearing the same warning repeated. Delon then revealed that their father had already granted permission for the duel to proceed. Even so, he desperately tried to change the outcome, offering to step into the arena himself and act as Cleanse's champion. Cleanse rejected the offer immediately, without leaving even the smallest opening for negotiation. Delon argued back, insisting that as the future ruler of the North, protecting his younger brother was not just a choice, but his responsibility. Then, in a rare moment where his anger cracked and something softer showed through, Delon remembered the first time he had ever seen Cleanse as an infant. Back then, the baby had looked like a beautiful angel in his eyes. From that day on, Delon had waited 7 long years for Cleanse to return from the monastery. With tears gathering in his eyes, Delon grabbed hold of Cleanse and pleaded with him to reconsider. His voice carried pure desperation, because to him, this duel looked less like a challenge and more like a death sentence for his little brother. Their emotional confrontation was suddenly cut short when a guard hurried in, bringing news that clearly could not wait. Count Delkin Cornwell had already made his move and chosen the champion who would fight in the duel. Cleanse abruptly wrenched himself free from his brother's grasp, his posture stiffening. With a voice that cut through the air like a blade, cold, clipped, and razor-focused, he demanded to know exactly who he would be forced to cross swords with. The guard didn't hesitate, revealing the name that made the surrounding air feel heavy. Randall. He was an excommunicated knight, a man whose reputation was built entirely on a foundation of brutal, blood-soaked battlefields. The perspective shifts to a dimly lit, grimy tavern. The heavy wooden doors groan as they swing wide, exposing the man himself. Randall stands there, a towering mountain of muscle, his eyes burning with a look of raw, unadulterated savagery that makes the very atmosphere of the room feel dangerous. Randall's history was as dark as his personality. He had been stripped of his knighthood and cast out by the orders, deemed too volatile to control. It wasn't just battle prowess. It was his insatiable, violent urge to slaughter anyone and everyone within his reach that made him a pariah. He sat amidst a scene of absolute wreckage, surrounded by shattered tables and the slumped forms of those he'd laid low. He didn't use a cup. He guzzled a deep, blood-red liquor straight from a wooden bucket, his face contorted into a mask of pure, monstrous fury. He let out a low, guttural mutter, his voice dripping with malice. He mused that it had been far too long since he'd had the pleasure of hearing a young boy scream, his anticipation for the upcoming massacre vibrating in every heavy breath he took. Back at the manor, Cleanse stood motionless, absorbing every word about his opponent. As the description of Randall's cruelty settled in, the boy's eyes hardened, transforming into pools of intense, cold determination that signaled he wasn't going to back down. Just then, an associate stepped forward, carefully cradling a blade wrapped in thick, protective fabric. He extended the weapon toward Cleanse, his expression grave, as if the very air between them had grown somber. "Here is the blade you requested," the man said, his voice low and cautious. "I have forged it exactly to your specifications. But, please, you must be extremely careful. The moment this steel clashes against a sword imbued with mana, it will shatter into 1,000 pieces." Cleanse accepted the wrapped sword with steady hands, his movements deliberate. He held it for a heartbeat, carefully inspecting the weight and balance of the weapon before letting out a soft, thoughtful sigh. After a brief pause, he met the man's gaze and spoke without a flicker of hesitation. "Understood. That will suffice. Let's head out immediately. There's no time to waste." Meanwhile, a wave of restless excitement was rippling through the arena. The news had traveled fast, and the stands were packed to the rafters, every seat filled by spectators dying to see what would happen next. The crowd was a sea of murmurs, all fixated on a single topic: the fact that Cleanse had finally stepped out to appear in person. A thick, palpable tension hung over the battlefield as thousands of eyes locked onto the entrance, brimming with raw curiosity and nervous anticipation. High above the fray, the noble box offered a bird's-eye view. One of the dignitaries glanced toward Cleanse's father, a look of genuine surprise etched across his face as he remarked, "To think that you would actually choose to show your face here in person." The noble tilted his head, a thin, patronizing smile creeping onto his lips. "But tell me, are you truly comfortable with this? My champion is a knight of the Empire, a veteran of countless slaughters. He's going to be far too much for your manaless son to handle. It's not too late to pull him out and send Lord Delane instead. Don't you think that's the wiser path?" Cleanse's father, however, remained a statue. He didn't twitch, didn't flinch, and didn't offer a single word of rebuttal. His face was a mask of cold composure, suggesting that his decision had been set in stone long before the conversation even began. Down on the floor, Cleanse walked toward the center of the arena with a steady stride. His eyes were constantly darting, scanning the massive space as he mentally prepared for the confrontation to come. He kept his focus on the horizon, a single thought echoing in his mind. Where is he, my opponent? Has the man still not deigned to show his face yet? But then, the world seemed to darken as an enormous shadow suddenly fell over him. A man of monstrous, hulking proportions stepped out, dwarfing everything around him. His frame was thick and corded, his muscles bulging beneath his armor as if he were carved from solid steel. He was a creature built for nothing but pure, unadulterated combat. The giant reached out, resting a massive, callous hand squarely on top of Clen's head. He looked down, his lips curling into an intimidating, predatory grin. "So," he rumbled, "you must be Lord Clen's then?" It was clear now this was Randall, the terror of the battlefield and the champion of Cornwall. He stared down at Clen's, his cruel smile stretching wider as he let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "You're honestly a lot younger than the rumors led me to believe." Randall's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits as he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "And your arms? Honestly, they look so fragile, like twigs. I really can't help but wonder," he sneered, "just what kind of pathetic sound your neck will make when it finally snaps." In that split second, the reality of the situation hit Clen's with crystal clarity. He didn't wait. With a burst of explosive speed, Clen's shoved himself backward, covering a massive amount of distance in a single, fluid leap that left his opponent grasping at thin air. The crowd gasped in unison, stunned by the sheer agility on display. A ripple of confusion tore through the stands. What on earth was that? Did you see how fast he moved back? Up in the noble seats, the same man from earlier peered over the edge, an amused smirk playing on his face. "Did you see that, Your Grace? He's already resorting to theatrics before the duel has even truly commenced. Do you honestly believe he can withstand a real onslaught from someone like Randall?" Meanwhile, Randall let out a low, mocking chortle, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Oh, how precious. Look at him, he's already absolutely terrified." But beneath his cautious, defensive expression, Clen's was thinking something entirely different. "That's not it at all. Damn it. That just genuinely startled me. It just triggered a memory of that priest grabbing my shoulder back then. I pulled away before I even realized what I was doing. That absolute bastard was useless until the very last second, and it left a mark." High above the chaos, Captain Leia Ren stood silently, her gaze locked onto the scene unfolding in the arena floor below. Her piercing eyes remained fixed entirely on Clen's, her expression unreadable as the air in the arena grew suffocatingly heavy with mounting tension. A guard scurried up to her, his voice trembling with anxiety. "Captain, if Lady Helen catches wind of you being here, she will be absolutely furious. We need to leave at once." Without shifting her gaze, Leia retorted coldly, "I don't care. That woman is not my mother." Deep in her own thoughts, a strange idea began to stir. If he actually manages to take down a knight of that caliber, I might just give him my lips. Even as the thought crossed her mind, her intense, focused stare never left the arena. "There is something I need to confirm," she added to herself, barely audible. Back down in the arena, Clen stood firm, feeling the weight of thousands of eyes bearing down on him. He felt a flush of embarrassment creep across his cheeks. Trying to project an air of calm confidence, he straightened his back, though his voice came out with a sharp, irritated edge. "Look, the truth is, I've been dealing with a bit of a stiff neck lately. So, I would strongly advise you not to reach for my shoulder again." Despite the clear warning, Randall, playing a cruel game, began to slowly extend his massive hand toward Clen's once more, clearly trying to get under his skin. The moment Clen saw the hand drifting toward him, his expression twisted into a mask of pure annoyance. He snapped, "I told you. Don't touch me, you perverted bastard. Are your ears actually clogged with muscle, too? I suppose that's exactly why the Empire had no choice but to throw you away." For a heartbeat, the entire arena went deathly quiet, as if the audience were holding its collective breath. Then, Randall's face contorted into a slow, savage grin. "Excellent," he growled in a low, dangerous tone. "The filthier your mouth is, the more satisfying it will be to hear you scream when I finally crush it." The second the words were out, Randall lunged. He threw a devastating raw power punch straight at Clen's. His massive fist whistled through the air with enough force to shatter a normal man's ribs without a second thought. However, in that exact critical instant, Clen's reached up with a calm, practiced motion and unbuttoned his coat. A split second later, boom! Randall's massive fist slammed into the solid stone of the arena floor. The impact was like an explosion, sending jagged cracks spiderwebbing across the ground. A thick cloud of dust and pulverized debris erupted into the air, obscuring the spot where the blow had landed. Randall's eyes went wide, filled with sudden, genuine shock. He looked down at his hand, and all he found clutched in his grip was the discarded coat. Cleanse had vanished from the spot entirely, slipping away before the massive fist could even make contact. The stands erupted into pure chaos. He shattered the ground, someone screamed. What kind of insane power was that? Wait! Look over there. The crowd's attention whipped to the opposite side of the arena. Cleanse was standing there, calm but alert, a short blade held firmly in his hand. His expression was grim, his eyes tracking Randall's every movement with precision. He muttered to himself, "That bastard. He really does have a temperament as nasty as they come." Then, in the depths of his own mind, Cleanse began to assess the fight with chilling calm. Just as he had predicted from the start, meeting Randall head-on was going to be extremely difficult. If that huge body landed even one clean hit on him, Cleanse knew he would be the one sent flying apart. He hated having to admit it, but this was not a fight where he could afford to relax, play around, or rely on luck. Meanwhile, outside the ring, the spectators kept whispering among themselves, their voices tight with nervous disbelief, as they stared at the massive gap in raw power between the two fighters. One man muttered that Cleanse had dodged surprisingly well, but then immediately wondered how he was supposed to beat a monster like Randall. Nearby, another spectator swallowed hard, his face pale as he spoke in shock. Even if that attack only grazed him, it would be enough to shatter his bones. The unease in the audience continued to spread, and several people murmured under their breath that Cleanse was doing nothing more than walking straight toward his own death. Nearby, Cleanse's friend could not help calling out his name, and in that tense moment, the words Cleanse had spoken earlier returned to his mind. If he took Cleanse's place in the trial by combat, it would only give their enemies a legal excuse to kill the Rhineland heir. As those words echoed again and again, he quietly admitted to himself that Cleanse was right. The future of the family was at stake, so he could not simply act on emotion. But before that thought could even fully settle, the clash on the other side of the arena had already begun moving again. Randall suddenly launched himself forward with terrifying speed, his massive frame closing the distance in the blink of an eye. Cleanse reacted immediately, drawing his sword in a sharp motion and swinging into an attack before Randall could completely overwhelm him. But Randall stopped the blade as if it were nothing, catching it with his bare hand. The sight of that raw strength sent a visible shock through everyone watching from the stands. Then, in the very next instant, Randall struck back with brutal force, driving Cleanse backward and making him slide across the ground. But Randall had no intention of giving him even a single breath to recover or reset his stance. With overwhelming speed, he appeared directly in front of Cleanse once more, pressing forward with a relentless chain of attacks that left almost no room to escape. As he attacked, Randall sneered at him with open contempt, asking if Cleanse really thought he could win this fight by doing nothing but dodging. Cleanse poured every bit of strength he had into blocking the incoming blows. Each strike crashed down heavier than the last, forcing his arms to tremble and pushing his body farther and farther back. Randall continued mocking him without the slightest mercy. He taunted Cleanse, asking why he did not just use his necromancy, since he was supposedly the great Ashimon. But the moment Randall looked straight into Cleanse's eyes, he noticed something that made his confidence waver. Cleanse was smiling. It was not the smile of someone relaxed, nor the smile of someone enjoying the fight. It was a strained, dangerous expression, filled with irritation and rage being barely held back. Deep inside, Cleanse's thoughts darkened with anger. This was getting irritating. For one brief moment, he even wondered if he should simply use necromancy and slaughter them all. After sensing that overwhelming pressure, even Randall's instincts betrayed him, and he stepped back before he could stop himself. Sweat began to run down Randall's face. His body had reacted faster than his mind could understand what he had just felt. The arrogance Randall had carried through the fight began to crack at the edges. In the audience, confused voices quickly spread through the stands. Some people asked if Randall had just dodged, while others insisted it was impossible and that he must have been holding back on purpose. But Randall himself knew better than anyone that this was not the truth. Inside his own mind, he struggled to make sense of what had just happened, asking himself what that feeling had been. There had been nothing visible in front of him. Cleanse had not made any obvious move, and yet Randall had clearly felt a dense, terrifying aura of death rising from him. It was not something Randall could see with his eyes, but every instinct in his body screamed at him to stay away. That invisible pressure alone was enough to make fear crawl under his skin. Seeing Randall suddenly retreat like that, the man seated high above the arena clicked his tongue in irritation. He shouted down in anger, demanding to know what Randall was doing and why he was acting so strangely. At that moment, Cleanse stepped forward calmly and spoke in a voice clear enough for everyone in the arena to hear. He told them not to worry, because he would not use anything like necromancy. After all, he was a Rhineland. This was a place where a person proved himself through the sword alone. Cleanse paused for a brief moment, then continued with firm certainty, declaring once again that he would not use necromancy. The instant those words rang out, shock rippled through the entire arena like a wave. His father, his friend, and almost everyone seated among the spectators stared at him in complete disbelief. No one had expected Cleanse to say something like that, especially when so many people had been looking at him with suspicion because of his necromancy. But hearing those words directly from Cleanse began to change the air around him. The mood in the crowd slowly shifted, and bit by bit, the people who had doubted him began to cheer for him instead. Voices rose from the stands, saying that this was exactly what a trial by combat should be. Some shouted that they were with him, while others declared they would support him. The arena, which had been filled with doubt and mockery only moments earlier, was gradually taken over by excitement, all because Cleanse had made his declaration without wavering. Randall poured even more mana into his blade. The energy gathering around the sword grew sharper and heavier, pressing through the air as he prepared himself for another decisive attack. Staring straight at Cleanse, Randall muttered with confidence that the brat had no mana. And that was exactly why the Imperial swordsmanship style was feared throughout the Empire. The true power of Imperial swordsmanship came from never holding back the user's mana, not even for an instant. By forcing every sense to its limit, breath, muscles, blood flow, reflexes, and focus, a swordsman could release one explosive burst of power, fast enough to hunt down an opponent in a single decisive moment. Randall gathered all of his strength into one devastating strike and charged forward at incredible speed, his blade cutting through the air with crushing force. Every bit of Randall's focus narrowed onto one goal, ending the fight with that single attack. But at that exact moment, Cleanse moved calmly out of the way. As his eyes followed Randall's movements, he quietly said that he could see it. Randall's technique, his mana capacity, even the path his blade would take through the air. Every detail had become clear to Cleanse, and his attacks now looked almost painfully obvious. To Cleanse, Randall was moving like nothing more than a damn fly. Those words struck Randall's pride directly and only made his anger burn even hotter. Once again, Randall gathered every ounce of strength he had and unleashed another attack. This time, the force behind it was even greater than before, nearly twice as powerful as his previous strike. The moment that attack crashed down, a massive explosion erupted across the arena. Dust and mist burst outward in every direction, swallowing the battlefield and turning the entire fighting ground into a cloud of chaos. The audience could barely see through the thick haze left behind by the impact, and many leaned forward, straining their eyes to make out what had happened. Randall's eyes widened in disbelief as realization struck him. Had Cleanse truly read every single trajectory of his sword in such a short amount of time? Then suddenly, Cleanse appeared behind him. Moving through the smoke without making a sound, Cleanse stepped perfectly into Randall's blind spot and prepared to counter. With a body that large, Randall's back was completely exposed. In the next instant, Cleanse struck. The timing was flawless. The precision, smoothness, and control behind Cleanse's technique were so incredible that everyone watching was left frozen in stunned silence. Even the experienced warriors seated around the arena could hardly believe what they had just witnessed with their own eyes. Meanwhile, deep inside his own mind, Randall was completely thrown off balance. His thoughts spun in confusion as he stared at Cleanse, unable to make sense of what he had just seen. None of this should have been possible. This bastard had no mana at all. Randall knew that much for certain. So how in the world was he still moving like that, striking like that, and keeping up with him? A short distance away, one of the soldiers standing beside Leia Ren stiffened in disbelief. His eyes were wide as he looked from the battlefield back to his captain and blurted out, "Did you see that just now, Captain?" At that same moment, Leia Ren stood watching Cleanse duel with a faint blush coloring her cheeks. The way he moved, the calm confidence in his stance, and the overwhelming skill he showed in front of everyone had clearly shaken her more than she wanted to admit. Soon after, the scene shifted somewhere else entirely, into a room weighed down by a heavy, suffocating silence. In the center of that stillness, a calm voice finally spoke, but beneath that calm was a deep frustration that could not be hidden. Normally, I would have stepped in myself before anyone else even had time to react. Another man immediately tried to answer him. "Your Grace, that's..." But before he could finish, Cleanse's father cut him off in a low, controlled voice. "I know." His expression darkened as he held back the emotions pressing against his chest. "I should not move based on personal feelings. If I step forward now, the prestige of the Rhineland family will only sink even further. Then his gaze turned colder. But the man standing against him is a knight from the Empire. Cleanse has absolutely no chance of winning. The words settled heavily in the room. The other man looked deeply troubled after hearing them, then asked with careful hesitation, "Then why did you allow the duel to happen?" For a moment, Cleanse's father said nothing. He simply stood there, as if years of regret were pressing down on his shoulders all at once. Only after a long silence did he finally speak. He stepped forward to defend the honor of his late mother. His voice carried a painful weight. Even when he was falsely branded as Ashamon and locked away in the monastery, I could not save him. His fists slowly clenched at his sides. So what right do I have to stop him now? The air in the room grew even heavier after those words. His face tightened with bitterness as he continued, almost as if condemning himself. In the end, I cannot protect anything. Not my child, not my family. Hearing such painful words from him, the other man quickly stepped in, trying to offer even the smallest bit of reassurance. You do not need to worry. Your Grace, the man said firmly, his tone steadier now. The young master is not someone who walks into a battle he knows he cannot win. Right after that, the scene returned once again to the battlefield where the duel was still unfolding before everyone's eyes. The fight had not ended yet, but even Cleanse's father could no longer hide the shock showing in his eyes. What was happening in front of him was far beyond what he had expected. And as the battle continued, the true history and nature of the Rhineland family's swordsmanship began to reveal itself. The Rhineland family was known throughout the land as the Northern Swordsmanship family. In order to survive the merciless frozen territory of the North, they had created a sword style that reduced mana consumption to the absolute limit. Every step, every swing, and every shift of the body was refined for efficiency, allowing them to conserve strength and mana while enduring long, brutal battles across those icy fields. Imperial swordsmanship, however, was something entirely different. It was not built for endurance or restraint. Imperial swordsmanship was predation itself. It was a sword style created for domination, a way of fighting that focused on crushing the enemy through sheer overwhelming force. By releasing a massive amount of mana all at once, an Imperial Knight would drown the opponent in pressure and destroy them before they had a chance to properly respond. But Rhineland swordsmanship followed the complete opposite path. Its strength did not come from reckless power or explosive force. It relied on patience, precision, and the ability to wait for the perfect opening. With the smallest amount of mana possible, it aimed for the one moment where a single strike could decide everything. That was the true essence of the Rhineland family's techniques. It was the ultimate form of swordsmanship that drew out maximum efficiency while using only the bare minimum amount of mana. As that realization slowly spread across the battlefield, Cleanse stood facing Randall directly. His posture remained calm, and his voice carried no hesitation when he spoke. This is how someone like me, without mana, can still use my family's techniques. Cleanse's eyes stayed steady, even as Randall's pressure continued pressing toward him. It may not have much power behind it, but it is still more than enough to beat down a guy like you. The instant those words reached Randall, his face warped with fury. Thick veins bulged across his face as he glared at Cleanse, his anger burning so fiercely that it looked like he might explode at any moment. You little rat. At the same time, an enormous amount of power suddenly began gathering through Randall's entire body. Mana erupted around him in violent waves, growing heavier and denser with every passing second. It was obvious to everyone watching that Randall was preparing to release every last bit of mana he possessed in one devastating attack. From above, the man observing the duel noticed the change immediately. His eyes sharpened as he focused on Randall's surging mana. His gaze widened slightly as the thought flashed through his mind. There it is. Randall's secret technique was finally appearing. A mana burst capable of sealing an opponent's movements in an instant. The pressure across the battlefield kept rising without pause, and the air itself seemed to grow heavier as Randall's power climbed higher and higher. Then Randall roared furiously, his voice ripping through the battlefield. Don't make me laugh, you bastard. I'm the one who will win. In the very next instant, Randall shot forward with terrifying speed. He closed the distance between himself and Cleanse almost instantly, then brought his attack crashing down with monstrous force, strong enough to crush his opponent in a single blow. But at the absolute last second, Cleanse reacted without the slightest hint of panic. His sword moved at the perfect moment, meeting Randall's attack head-on and stopping the blow directly in front of him. But everyone watching still remembered one crucial warning about that sword, something that had been said at the very beginning of the duel. The moment it clashed against a mana-infused sword, it would shatter. And exactly as predicted, the instant cleanse blocked Randall's mana-filled strike. Cracks raced across the blade. A heartbeat later, the sword completely broke apart, sending sharp fragments scattering through the air. When Randall saw the blade shatter, a victorious smirk immediately spread across his face. "Serves you right. With this, your sword is..." But before Randall could even finish mocking him, Cleanse suddenly smiled. "Yeah," Cleanse said calmly, his expression completely unfazed. "Now it is finally complete. The weapon made to hunt you." For a brief moment, Randall froze, unable to understand what Cleanse meant by those words. Then it happened. Cleanse moved forward in a flash, closing in before Randall could fully grasp the danger. Instead of treating the shattered sword as a useless broken weapon, Cleanse used the remaining blade like a short mana blade made for close-range combat. Before Randall could properly react, Cleanse stepped straight into his range. At point-blank distance, his strike flashed out, a sharp and precise slash cutting through the battlefield in an instant. Randall's arm was sliced clean off. The severed arm flew through the air as blood scattered wildly around him, and his face twisted in complete shock and agony. A horrifying scream tore from his throat as he staggered and collapsed backward. At that moment, a loud voice rang out across the battlefield, cutting through the chaos. "The duel is over." Among the people watching the fight, one man stared at the battlefield in utter disbelief. Just as the young master had said, Rhineland swordsmanship could be performed with minimal mana, but that should have been possible only for a seasoned knight. Yet Cleanse had executed everything flawlessly, from the movement of his feet to the path traced by his sword. And more than that, he had deliberately lured Randall into breaking his weapon, using that very moment to strike from point-blank range. No matter how the man looked at it, he could barely believe what had just unfolded right in front of his eyes. This was the young master's complete and perfect victory. On the battlefield, Randall was still screaming in agony, clutching at the place where his arm had been severed as pain overwhelmed him. Immediately, a group of healers rushed toward him in a panic, their faces tense as they hurried to save him. "Hurry up and stop the bleeding. Quickly hold his arm down. Cast sleep magic." The entire area fell into chaos at once, with healers rushing around Randall in a panic as they desperately tried to stop his body from worsening any further. Meanwhile, Cleanse only stood there and watched the frantic scene with a strangely calm expression. Then, in a quiet voice, he asked, "Can that be reattached?" But despite how composed he sounded, there was a clear trace of disappointment on his face. After checking how serious the wound was, the healers quickly gave their answer. "No, basic healing magic will only stabilize him. We will need to prepare a prosthetic arm." Hearing that, Cleanse simply blinked and replied in a flat tone, "Oh, really? Is that all?" At the same time, deep inside his mind, Cleanse quietly thought to himself that even after 200 years, healing magic had barely advanced at all. Just then, from the other side of the battlefield, his father called out to him with a grave expression on his face. "You feel nothing after watching a limb get severed?" The moment those words reached Cleanse, his expression shifted ever so slightly, as if he had suddenly realized something important. Right? He was not Ashimon right now. Cleanse reminded himself of that silently, forcing his thoughts to return to the identity he was supposed to be wearing in front of everyone. After that, Cleanse quietly turned and began walking away, acting as though the duel had already ended and there was nothing more worth seeing. As he moved forward with calm steps, he wondered to himself whether he should pretend to be frightened now. At that very moment, the true mastermind behind the entire incident finally stepped forward. His face was twisted with disbelief and rage as he shouted, "This makes no sense. Randall losing? Do you even know how much money I spent to hire that knight?" Before he could continue venting his anger, Cleanse's father suddenly spoke from behind him in a cold, commanding voice. "Count Delken Cornwell." The man immediately turned toward him. Cleanse's father stared at him sharply and continued, "As agreed, admit your wrongdoing and fulfill the victor's demands." Count Delken Cornwell's face contorted with frustration and desperation. His voice trembled as he tried to defend himself. "I have lost my son and my exclusive knight. How can I possibly?" But before he could even finish speaking, something horrifying happened. In that instant, it looked as if his head had been cleanly sliced from his body. For a split second, everyone around him froze in stunned silence. Then the focus fell on Cleanse's cold, emotionless eyes. He stared directly at the man as if looking straight through him and spoke his name in a chilling tone. "Delken Cornwell." The next moment revealed the truth. Delkin Cornwell was still alive, and his head had never truly been cut off. Even so, his whole body shook violently as his hands flew to his neck again and again, frantically checking whether it was still attached. What he had experienced was only an illusion, born from the terrifying pressure of cleansed power. But to Delcan, that illusion had felt completely real. Panic exploded inside his mind. What was that? His neck had definitely been. Sweat poured down his face as fear swallowed him whole. Cleanse then stepped forward until he was standing directly in front of him, his presence pressing down like a blade against Delkin's throat. His voice was quiet, but terrifyingly cold. As the victor of this duel, I command you, confess your sins before the Master of the North, then kneel and beg for forgiveness. His voice grew even heavier after that, sinking lower and colder, almost as if death itself had begun speaking through him. Lower your head and beg for mercy. You will be crushed beneath the weight of your sins, and you will repent. The moment those words entered Delkin Cornwell's ears, true terror took hold of him. In that instant, it was almost as if he could see death itself standing right above his head, waiting to fall. His entire body trembled uncontrollably. Cold sweat dripped endlessly down his face, and even drawing breath became difficult. With his will completely broken, he finally collapsed under the pressure. I was wrong, he stuttered in a terrified voice, barely able to force the words out. My son and I dared to plot against young Master Cleanse at the same time. The terrifying power Cleanse had used was finally revealed in full. It was originally a voice meant to summon and command the souls of the dead man's voice. This soul-shaking technique belonged only to necromancers, a dreadful power capable of stirring extreme terror inside the hearts of the living. Delkin Cornwell completely broke down in front of Cleanse. Trembling from head to toe, he dropped to his knees and bowed deeply, begging for forgiveness with his voice cracking. Furthermore, I insulted the young master's mother, Grand Duchess Claire. He confessed in desperation. Please forgive me. The people watching could hardly believe what was happening before their eyes. One spectator stared at the sight in utter shock and muttered, Am I really seeing this? A pillar of the Branch family is actually crumbling like that. Meanwhile, Cleanse slowly raised his shattered sword toward the sky. Even with the blade broken, the pressure surrounding him felt heavier and more commanding than ever before. Then, standing before everyone gathered there, he began to speak with absolute confidence. Good. This begins from here. His voice carried across the entire battlefield, drawing every gaze toward him. Everyone standing here, listen closely. This is the declaration of my existence. In an instant, the entire area fell silent. To set this family right, I am the challenger of this trial by combat, and I am its rightful victor. His eyes did not waver for even a moment as he continued his declaration. I am the son of Grand Duchess Claire Latalassus, and the second son of the North's strongest knight, Heinkel Rhineland. Then, with pride in his voice, he declared his name before every person present. I am Cleanse Rhineland. After that powerful declaration echoed through the battlefield, the scene shifted to a completely different place. The atmosphere there was much calmer, yet far heavier, carrying a quiet solemnity that almost felt sacred. A man entered a silent hall, and nearby, a priest continued praying softly. We shall go where your light does not reach. Even if the path ahead is perilous, even if pain waits for us there, please watch over our intent, O God of light. Just then, the man who had entered stepped forward, his expression tense as he called out to the praying priest. Cardinal Murak. The priest slowly turned his head toward him and answered calmly, Yes, Garrison. Your voice sounds grim. What is the matter? Garrison's expression remained severe as he answered without delay. The surveillance target was attacked. The attackers were a necromancer and his undead. For a brief moment, the room went silent. Then Garrison added in a firmer voice, I need to verify this. I need to verify it personally. However, Cardinal Murak showed no sign of concern at all. Instead, he replied with unsettling calm, as if the matter had never been worth worrying about. There is no need to be concerned. Everything happened according to plan. He was dispatched in cooperation with the Empire. Garrison's eyes narrowed slightly at those words. Cardinal Murak continued speaking as though he were explaining something perfectly reasonable. A necromancer is an existence that naturally inspires fear. Those frightened by such a sight will inevitably seek out God. Countless people will gather beneath our holy order. Then his voice turned colder, and the warmth of prayer vanished completely from the room. Understand this, Garrison. If we can revive the holy order and spread God's will through only a handful of sacrifices, But before Cardinal Murak could finish, Garrison suddenly moved. In a single instant, Garrison seized Cardinal Murak by the throat with overwhelming force, cutting off his words completely. His eyes burned with fury as he spoke through clenched teeth. A servant of the Holy Temple has lowered himself to petty political games and made deals with heretics. The next moment, with nothing but raw strength, Garrison crushed the Cardinal's head completely. Blood burst across the hall as the Cardinal's lifeless body collapsed onto the ground, leaving the once quiet sacred space stained in red. Right after that, another voice suddenly echoed through the blood-soaked hall. "Do you feel any better?" A man slowly stepped forward through the crimson-stained scene, looking directly at Garrison as he spoke in a calm yet mocking tone. "You have not changed, Garrison Veerman. To think you have killed more clergymen than the necromancers themselves." A faint smile appeared on his face as he continued speaking. "The people of the Holy Order really ought to know what you are hiding inside that stomach of yours." The man standing there was none other than the Archbishop of the Holy Order, Palamon L. Garrison glared at him coldly after hearing those words, his killing intent still lingering in the air. "Was this your doing, Palamon L.?" Palamon answered without the slightest hesitation. "Of course not. I merely authorized it." Then the mocking look on his face faded, and his expression became far more serious. "And besides," he added in that same calm voice, "I came here with a piece of information about the person you've been watching." The instant those words reached Garrison's ears, his eyes turned sharp, and without the slightest hesitation, he launched himself forward to attack Palamon as well. Garrison's fist tore through the air with terrifying force, the kind of strike that would have crushed an ordinary man on the spot. But Palamon was nothing like an ordinary opponent. His movement was far faster than anything normal eyes could easily follow. Before Garrison could even fully register what had happened, Palamon had already vanished from the space directly in front of him. In the next blink, he appeared somewhere else entirely, slipping past the blow as if it had never threatened him at all. Then, with the same composed expression, Palamon continued speaking like the attack had been nothing more than a passing breeze. When necromancy is used, it always leaves traces behind. As he spoke, Palamon lifted a strange object shaped like a cross, letting Garrison see it clearly. "This cross," he explained, "contains those traces. It came from the necromancer you killed." Garrison's face stiffened, and his attention locked completely onto Palamon's words. Palamon went on, saying that one of the traces belonged to soul-returning arts, a form of necromancy that raises corpses, and something the Empire had already begun researching. Then his voice sank a little lower, carrying a heavier meaning. "But the other trace is different. That one is closer to necromancy's original form, the kind that controls souls themselves instead of merely moving dead bodies." The moment Garrison heard that, his reaction was immediate. His gaze sharpened as he repeated the words back in disbelief. "The original form of necromancy?" Palamon met his stare without wavering and answered simply, "Yes." Palamon remained calm, but the air between them suddenly grew much heavier. "That means," he said, "there were 2 necromancers present at the scene that day." Then Palamon fixed his eyes directly on Garrison, his expression turning grave. He spoke slowly now, spacing out each word as if he wanted Garrison to feel the weight of every syllable. "Listen carefully, Garrison. The person you've been keeping under surveillance, the second son of the Rhineland family." After a brief, heavy silence, Palamon finally said the name aloud. "Cleanse Rhineland is a necromancer." After that, the view shifted beneath a curtain of light rain falling from the gray sky. Far below, deep inside a dark cave, a faint glow flickered in the distance, barely pushing back the thick shadows around it. Inside that cave, someone was mining all alone, with no one else anywhere nearby. The sharp sound of metal striking stone rang again and again through the narrow tunnel, echoing off the damp walls. After a while, the miner finally stopped moving, straightened his back, and slowly stood up to catch his breath. But the very moment he turned around, something horrifying appeared behind him. A devilish hand, twisted and inhuman, reached out from the darkness as if it had been waiting there the entire time. Before the miner could even understand what was creeping up behind him, the creature moved first. It lunged from his blind spot and attacked him instantly, giving him no time to scream or defend himself. The scene then moved to Little Maid, who was staring at something in front of her with a deeply troubled look on her face. Her shoulders seemed to droop from embarrassment as she muttered, "This is a disaster." Somehow, she had ended up making a doll that looked exactly like the young master's face. And the worst part was, it really did resemble him perfectly. Even while she sounded troubled, there was a strange little pride mixed into her voice, and an awkward smile crept onto her face. Right in front of her, Cleanse sat quietly, flipping through a stack of documents with a calm expression, barely reacting to her little crisis at all. By then, a full week had passed since the trial by combat. During that trial, Cleanse had defeated Landel, the champion who stepped forward to represent them, using the Rhineland family's own technique. After that, he had used the dead man's voice technique to pull a confession from Count Cornwell, then openly revealed his existence in front of the Branch family faction for everyone to witness. After achieving all of that, Cleanse had honestly thought the people around him would finally begin to acknowledge him. But as that thought passed through his mind, his face slowly filled with exhaustion. The real problem, he realized, was that this 15-year-old body simply did not have enough stamina to keep up with everything he needed to do. Cleanse glanced over at Little Maid with an irritated look and said that if she was done playing around, she should hurry back to her room and sleep. The moment she heard that, Little Maid puffed up her cheeks in protest and complained that he was being mean again, saying he always got to play by himself. Cleanse stared at her as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard, then replied that he wasn't playing at all. Couldn't she see he was reading? Little Maid folded her arms across her chest and refused to back down. To her, it was just a novel, so in the end, that still counted as playing. But in truth, only the cover made it look like an ordinary novel. Hidden inside those pages were Cleanse's own secret notes, packed with information about anatomy, magic circuits, and spell formations. Every bit of it was connected to necromancy. Cleanse quietly lifted his teacup and took a sip, his thoughts continuing to turn beneath his calm expression. With his current body, he could summon 11 skeletons at most. His control over them was stable enough, but if he ever had to fight a long battle of attrition, the numbers were nowhere near sufficient. He would need to dig much deeper into his research. Then his expression gradually darkened as another concern pressed into his mind. The biggest problem was that damn priest. The man looked like he would wipe out even the smallest seed of necromancy if he found it. He was already suspicious of Cleanse, which meant Cleanse had to somehow recover his original power before the priest came looking for him. But the question was, how could he do that without exposing himself to everyone around him? Right after that, the scene shifted to his father, who was discussing what sounded like an urgent matter. With a serious look, he said they had received reports of sightings of something strange at the mine. They were commonly called undead. The moment Cleanse heard that word, his eyes narrowed with sudden focus. In his mind, one thought immediately rose above all the others. This was exactly what he had been waiting for. Without wasting even a second, Cleanse looked straight at his father and said that he would go. At the same time, another thought flashed through him with cold certainty. Real combat would be the best kind of research. His father seemed taken aback by how quickly Cleanse made the decision. Concern showed on his face as he asked whether Cleanse would truly be all right, since there had already been reports of casualties. Cleanse answered calmly that there would be no problem, but inwardly, his mind was already working through the situation. After the trial by combat, even Heinkel had acknowledged him. And if these were undead, they might be connected to the creature that had attacked him before. To Cleanse, this was not just a mission, it was an opportunity. The scene then moved to the mission site itself, where a knight stood respectfully at Cleanse's side. With a formal tone, he explained that the Duke had ordered him to accompany the young master for his safety. When Cleanse heard that, he silently thought that he should have expected as much. Meanwhile, the knight in front of him looked surprisingly relaxed for someone on a dangerous mission. He even smiled cheerfully and commented that the night sky looked amazing while they were out in the field. A moment later, the knight held out a freshly prepared dish toward Cleanse and told him to eat it while it was still hot. Cleanse glanced at it and immediately answered in a flat, calm voice, "No thanks." But the knight still did not seem ready to give up. With an awkward look, he tried again and said that as Cleanse's escort, he should at least do some work too. Cleanse's gaze shifted toward the fire, where a completely burnt lump sat nearby like a piece of blackened charcoal. Then he replied coldly, asking if Dunkel could not see that scorched disaster right there. According to Cleanse, Dunkel helping by staying completely still was already more than enough. During this mission, Cleanse learned one unexpected fact. Dunkel, despite supposedly being a knight commander, was absolutely hopeless when it came to practical skills like cooking or hunting. Hearing that blunt judgment, Dunkel could only smile in embarrassment, lower his head a little, and admit that he had no face to show. He truly did not know what to say. Cleanse let out a small, tired sigh and told him to forget about it. He should just eat for now, and Cleanse would grill more food in a bit. At the same time, another thought drifted through Cleanse's mind. He had spent more than a decade running from the Allied Knight Orders, so compared to that, preparing food at a campsite was nothing. After that, the atmosphere around the campfire gradually settled into something quieter and more peaceful. The flames crackled gently in front of them, sending small sparks into the air, while the dark night stretched endlessly overhead. Then Dunkel suddenly spoke again, but this time his tone was much more serious. He said that whenever he watched Cleanse, he felt the young master was different from other boys his age. During the trial by combat, Cleanse had hidden both his talent with the sword and the strength of his spirit. Dunkel paused for a moment, choosing his words more carefully before continuing. Because of that, Dunkel admitted that he sometimes wondered whether Cleanse might actually be the reincarnation of Ashimon. The instant that name left his mouth, Cleanse's entire expression changed. Cleanse immediately turned his eyes toward Dunkel and warned him in a cold voice never to say something like that in front of that priest. Dunkel panicked at once, quickly raising both hands as if to prove he meant no harm, and hurriedly answered that of course he would never do that. After all, Ashimon was a demon who had once turned tens of millions of people in the north into undead. The moment those words were spoken, the campfire in front of them suddenly flared up with violent force. The flames swelled higher and fiercer than before, roaring as the heat spread out across the campsite and the quiet crackling turned harsh and loud. Only moments earlier, the area had been calm, with the two of them sitting beneath the dark evening sky. That sudden, unnatural change struck Dunkel immediately, leaving him visibly shocked as the flames surged in front of him. Seeing the campfire suddenly surge in front of him, Cleanse slowly raised his head, his gaze lifting from the flames with a chilling calmness. His face was no longer relaxed at all. Anger was written clearly across his expression as he spoke in a cold, warning tone, telling Dunkel to never, ever bring up that matter again. Dunkel froze on the spot, completely caught off guard by Cleanse's sudden reaction. Confusion and alarm crossed his face at the same time as he carefully called out, "Young master." But before either of them could continue the conversation, sharp screams suddenly rang out from behind them. Both of them turned toward the noise at once, only to see a horrifying corpse-like creature crawling out from the darkness. Inside the village, chaos had already erupted everywhere. The streets were filled with panic as terrified villagers ran in every direction, desperately trying to escape with their lives. Screams echoed through the night as people shouted, "It's the undead! Everyone run!" Countless undead creatures rushed after the villagers with terrifying speed, their twisted bodies moving in an unnatural, jerking way as they attacked anyone they could reach. At that exact moment, Dunkel arrived at the scene. The instant Dunkel stepped into the village, his sword flashed. With overwhelming force, he cut down several undead monsters at once, moving so fast that the creatures barely had time to react before they were torn apart. He did not stop for even a second. Dunkel charged deeper into the village, slaughtering one monster after another as he pushed forward through the chaos. After advancing quite a distance, he suddenly looked back and shouted for Cleanse. But when Dunkel turned around, Cleanse was already moving behind him, calmly advancing across the battlefield while eliminating every remaining monster in his path. Unlike the frightened villagers, his face showed no panic at all. As Cleanse cut down the undead one after another, he spoke in a cold, steady voice, asking Dunkel what he was doing standing there. Then he ordered him to go save the people. The moment Dunkel heard that command, he straightened his posture and answered loudly, "Yes, sir." Not long after that, the two of them began working together, completely overpowering the undead that had flooded the village. One by one, the monsters were destroyed until none of them could threaten the villagers anymore. At last, the people who had been running for their lives were pulled back from the edge of disaster. As the village slowly quieted down, the surviving residents gathered together, still shaken and hardly able to believe they were alive. One villager stepped forward with gratitude and confusion mixed across his face, thanking them for their help before asking who they were. Dunkel immediately answered with pride that the person before them was the second young master of the Rhineland family. The moment the villagers heard the Rhineland name, their eyes widened in shock, and the atmosphere shifted as they stared at Cleanse with disbelief and surprise. But Dunkel did not let the conversation linger there for long. His expression quickly turned serious as he brought the focus back to the real problem and asked when those things had first started appearing. Meanwhile, Cleanse quietly examined the undead corpses scattered across the village ground. After observing them carefully, he calmly said that this was a type of reanimation magic used to revive corpses and control them. His eyes narrowed slightly as he reached the answer in his mind. Just as he expected, it was the same technique as the one that had attacked him in the forest before. Right after that, one of the villagers hurried forward and answered that it had begun 2 months earlier. It happened right after the Count's family restricted access to the mine. Around that same time, people from the village began disappearing as well. As he spoke, His voice trembled with both fear and anger. Then the villager added that the undead they had just fought were all residents from their own village. The instant Cleanse heard that, his expression changed. Shock appeared clearly on his face as he slowly turned back toward the villager and asked what he had just said. But before anything else could be said, another man suddenly rushed forward and grabbed Cleanse tightly by the clothes. His hands clenched with desperation as he shouted right into Cleanse's face, demanding to know whether he was a Rhineland. Seeing the man lay his hands on Cleanse so aggressively, Dunkel immediately stepped in, anger flashing across his face as he shouted at the villager and demanded to know what he thought he was doing to the young master. Dunkel forcefully pulled the villager back, trying to separate him from Cleanse. But even then, the man kept struggling and screaming. He shouted that they had begged for help for 2 whole months without receiving a single response, and now only 2 people had finally shown up just to ask when it all began. As he spoke, his voice started to crack, with grief and rage pouring out together. Then he pointed toward one of the corpses lying nearby and shouted that the person they had just cut down was his father. It was the very same miner who had been seen at the beginning. The villager's pain only grew sharper as he cried out that his father had done nothing wrong. All he ever did was work day and night at the mine. Then, with his voice full of anguish, he asked why they had to suffer through something so cruel. Cleanse stood there in silence, not answering right away, while countless thoughts raced through his mind. Again and again, the name Ashimon echoed inside his head. As that name continued to weigh on him, Cleanse's expression slowly darkened, and the anger inside him became impossible to ignore. Finally, Cleanse looked at the villager with cold eyes and spoke in an irritated voice, telling him he was too loud and ordering him to shut up. Then he asked with icy calm, why any of that was supposed to be his fault. Cleanse continued coldly, making it clear that he was not the one who had turned the man's father and the other villagers into undead. If the man wanted to pour out his anger, then he should at least choose the proper target. The moment those words left Cleanse's mouth, flames slowly began to rise from his hand, casting a bright glow across the dark village around him. Seeing this, Dunkel quickly stepped forward and tried to stop him, saying he would handle things there. But before Dunkel could finish, Cleanse had already begun chanting in a solemn voice. He called upon the innocent spirits who had died in sorrow, commanding them with a voice that made the entire atmosphere grow heavy. Dunkel stared at him in complete shock as Cleanse continued the incantation. Cleanse then declared that he would light the guide's lantern and illuminate their path. His voice echoed through the now silent village as the flames around him flickered in an unnatural way. Then Cleanse spoke his own name, declaring that he, Cleanse Rhineland, would uphold their will. Raising his glowing hand slightly forward, he commanded the spirits to follow his guidance. At that moment, an unbelievable sight unfolded before everyone gathered there. Blue souls began slowly rising out from the undead bodies scattered across the village, one after another. The spirits that had been trapped inside those corpses were finally being released from their prison. The glowing souls floated quietly into the air, hovering above the ground as they looked down at their own lifeless bodies below. Cleanse was doing all of this through his own power. The freed spirits began speaking softly among themselves, but the language they used was one that only Cleanse could understand. After listening closely for a short while, Cleanse quietly answered them, saying that he understood. The villagers who witnessed the scene were left completely speechless. Every face was filled with shock, disbelief, and the kind of awe that made it impossible for them to look away. Then one of them suddenly spoke in astonishment, saying this was a technique said to have been used 200 years ago during the plague in the north, a technique meant to liberate the dead. Meanwhile, the same villager who had blamed Cleanse earlier slowly turned his gaze toward the spirit of his father. The old man's spirit turned back toward Cleanse for a moment. Then he looked at his son with a gentle smile on his face, and little by little, his soul drifted away together with the others. Right after that, one of the spirits pointed toward the mountains and told them that the mine was in that direction. The spirit explained that they only needed to follow the mountain path straight upward. Later, as Dunkel followed behind Cleanse, he finally broke the silence and asked what Cleanse had spoken about with the spirits earlier. Cleanse answered calmly, without turning around, that it had been nothing important. He said the spirits had simply thanked him for helping them pass on. But for one brief moment, his expression darkened, and then he added that they had also begged him to take revenge. Dunkel quietly repeated that word under his breath. Revenge. At that instant, the memories from earlier returned to Dunkel's mind. He remembered the moment he had wondered whether Cleanse might truly be the reincarnation of Ashimon, and he remembered Cleanse's furious warning to never speak of that matter again. The suspicion in Dunkel's heart only grew deeper. Then, without warning, Dunkel drew his sword and placed the blade directly against Cleanse's neck. His voice turned cold as he asked one clear question. Who exactly was Cleanse? After that, the story shifted into the past. Inside the grand estate, anxious voices filled the halls as people whispered among themselves in fear and disbelief, asking whether this boy was truly Lord Cleanse Rhineland. After 7 long years shut away inside the monastery, the young master finally returned to the family estate. The cursed child who had once called himself Ashimon had come back home at last. But what truly unsettled everyone was not simply the fact that he had returned. What disturbed them most was the look in his eyes. His pitch-black gaze was hollow, so empty that it almost seemed to reflect nothing at all. Those eyes felt far too cold and lifeless to belong to a child so young. Anyone who met his stare felt a strange chill crawl down their back, as if something invisible had brushed against them. And perhaps everything really did begin on that day. The first dead cat was found in the estate's kitchen, lying still where the servants passed through every day. Not long after that, a second body was discovered in the backyard garden. Then, as if the nightmare refused to end, another one appeared the very next day. One by one, more bodies began turning up across the estate, until at last the number of dead cats had reached 7. The cats had been found in different corners of the estate, and fear spread quickly among servants and nobles alike. Whispers followed in every hallway. Some claimed he had used necromancy the very moment he was born. Others said his mother's bloodline had always been connected to dark magic. Didn't he call himself Ashimon? Then the rumors must have been true from the start. It had to be a cursed bloodline. Before long, nearly everyone inside the estate had begun suspecting the same person. But even as the tension grew and those terrifying rumors wrapped tighter around him, the young master himself showed no reaction at all. Ever since Cleanse returned to the estate, he had only sat quietly by the window, staring outside in silence, as if all the whispers and fearful glances around him meant absolutely nothing. Nearby, one of the knights lowered his voice and spoke carefully. Everyone keeps saying the young master might be Ashimon, but he is still only a child. He is far too young. These strange incidents may have nothing to do with him at all. Then, deep in the night, while the entire estate lay asleep beneath the darkness of midnight, Dunkel suddenly noticed a small figure walking alone through the hallway. Young master? Where could he possibly be going at this hour? But Cleanse did not stop, and he did not even turn his head. Without offering a single word, he simply continued forward, his small silhouette disappearing deeper and deeper into the darkness. A faint uneasiness settled over Dunkel. Keeping his footsteps quiet and his distance measured, he followed behind Cleanse without letting the young master notice him. After following him for some time, Cleanse finally stopped at a place that made Dunkel freeze in place, his eyes widening with surprise. The cemetery? Why would the young master come to a place like this in the middle of the night? Only a thin wash of moonlight slipped between the rows of old tombstones, leaving most of the cemetery swallowed in shadow. Dunkel narrowed his eyes, struggling to see past the graves. I can barely make anything out because of these tombstones. Should I move closer and check? Step by careful step, Dunkel slipped forward between the gravestones, keeping his body low and his movements quiet, until he finally found an angle where he could clearly see the young master. And the instant Dunkel saw what was laid out before him, his eyes opened wide in disbelief. What in the world is this? There, surrounded by the bodies of the dead cats, stood young Master Cleanse. He seemed to be preparing something in silence beside those small, lifeless creatures. When Dunkel's voice broke through the stillness, Cleanse slowly turned around and looked back at him with the same dark, emotionless eyes. Then, with a voice so calm it almost felt unnatural in that cold cemetery, Cleanse quietly answered, I am going to perform funeral rites for them now. Dunkel stared at him in confusion, his gaze moving from Cleanse to the dead cats and back again. Pardon? Funeral rites? Cleanse lowered his eyes toward the cats lying before him and explained in the same steady tone. From the lesions on their bodies, this appears to be an infectious disease. It does not harm humans, but for animals it is fatal. If their bodies are simply left here, the disease will keep spreading. Other beasts may dig them up as well, and then the infection could reach even farther. At those words, Dunkel's expression shifted slightly. For a moment, he could only stand there and watch the young master kneeling in the cold cemetery, in the dead of night, handling the infected corpses with his own small hands. Your hands will be ruined, Dunkel said, concern tightening his voice. We should call someone else to take care of this. But Cleanse only shook his head slowly. Someone has to do it either way. His voice stayed calm and flat, almost without emotion, yet somehow those words carried a strange sincerity. A task that someone had to take on. And with those quiet words lingering in the cold night air, that memory from the past slowly reached its end. The moment returned to the present. The air between them had grown unbearably tense. Dunkel stood directly in front of Cleanse, his sword pressed against the young master's neck. His sharp eyes carried suspicion, hesitation, and confusion all at once as he demanded the truth. Tell me, then, who exactly are you? Even after hearing that question, young Master Cleanse remained perfectly calm. He did not rush to answer. Instead, he looked quietly at Dunkel and spoke in a composed voice. Let me ask you something first. Do you remember the very first saying of Berkel Rhineland? Dunkel answered without the slightest hesitation, as though those words had been carved deep into his heart long ago. It is one's actions, not their roots, that define a being. Cleanse gave a faint nod. Yes, that is right. Then he continued, his voice slow and steady. The reason you, a poor peasant, were able to rise up and become captain of the knights, and the reason I, the son of a foreign mother, am still alive today, is because of those very words. The silence between them grew even heavier. Since I left the monastery, you are the one who has spent the most time by my side. Dunkel. Cleanse looked straight into his eyes as he spoke, without avoiding the blade at his throat. So you decide. If you truly believe that I am Ashimon, then cut me down. The moment those words fell from his lips, the tension in the air became so thick it felt suffocating. Dunkel's sword stayed frozen in place for several long seconds. Then, at last, his arm slowly moved, and the blade lowered away from Cleanse's neck. Even so, the doubt in Dunkel's eyes had not completely vanished. I have not made my decision yet, he said firmly, and I am certainly not convinced. His fingers tightened around the sword hilt before his voice dropped colder. However, the one I serve is the second young master of Rhineland. Cleanse. Not some atrocious devil feared across the continent. After hearing Dunkel's answer, Cleanse quietly turned his head and looked into the deeper darkness ahead of them. Then he calmly said, we need to move forward. With that, the two of them continued farther into the underground passage. The deeper they walked, the colder and heavier the air became, as though the very breath of death was pressing in around them. Inside his mind, Cleanse silently thought, I see. Thanks for the compliment. As they pushed onward, the darkness around them thickened until the path ahead was almost impossible to make out. Realizing they could barely see another step forward, Dunkel lit a torch. Orange fire flared to life, its trembling light crawling over the stone walls, and finally exposing the horrifying sight that had been hiding in the blackness. The smell of corpses filled the air. All around them lay countless dead bodies. More precisely, many of those remains had already rotted down until only skeletons were left. Bones were scattered and piled across the ground in every direction, turning the underground chamber into a grim, unsettling grave of tangled remains. But then, from somewhere ahead, Dunkel caught sight of something moving. Some of the corpses in front of them had begun to shift, their lifeless bodies slowly stirring in the torchlight. The instant Dunkel realized what was happening, his expression hardened. I can see 7 of them. There must be more deeper inside. At that moment, Cleanse stepped forward with complete calm and began chanting in a cold, controlled voice. I call upon you. Answer me. His words echoed through the dark chamber, and then he continued. I grant you flesh to crush your enemies. The instant those words rang out, the skeletons scattered across the ground began to react. One after another, undead bodies lifted themselves from the floor, then rushed forward toward the enemies waiting ahead. Dunkel's eyes widened in utter shock as the battle erupted in front of him without warning. Inside the cramped underground chamber, the undead creatures slammed violently into one another, filling the narrow space with chaos. Bones cracked apart, weapons crashed together, and terrifying growls rolled through the darkness as the corpses clawed, struck, and tore into each other. Watching it all unfold before him, Dunkel could hardly believe his own eyes. This makes no sense. Skeletons that look like that actually exist? Cleanse glanced toward him after hearing the remark and answered calmly. Dalton's mercenaries said the same thing. Then, with the faintest trace of amusement in his voice, he added, is it really that fascinating? Before long, the battle finally came to an end. The remaining undead dropped one after another, their bones breaking apart and their bodies crumbling back to the ground as silence slowly returned to the chamber. Dunkel immediately stepped forward, lifting the torch higher so its light could reach farther down the path. Young master, this way. Then, from deeper inside the underground ruins, horrifying sounds began to echo again. Dunkel instantly tightened his grip around his sword, holding himself still as he listened carefully to the movements waiting ahead. From the echo alone, Dunkel could tell there were roughly 40 enemies closing in. His face darkened as the weight of their situation settled over him in an instant. They were surrounded, and the numbers were clearly against them. But Cleanse was nothing like Dunkel. Even with enemies gathering in the darkness, his expression did not waver in the slightest. Without showing even a hint of fear, he slowly lifted one hand and began chanting again. His voice cold, steady, and commanding. I release the bindings that shroud your bodies. The air around them suddenly became heavy, as if the entire underground chamber had been pressed down by an invisible force. Dark energy spread outward across the battlefield while Cleanse continued. Free your souls bound in agony and obey my command. And in that moment, the same terrifying sight from before unfolded once again. The defeated undead scattered across the ground began to twitch, then slowly rise, their broken bodies moving under Cleanse's control. Dunkel stared with widened eyes, hardly able to look away from the corpses lifting themselves back up. Young master, is this? Cleanse kept his gaze fixed forward and answered calmly, as if the sight before them was nothing unusual, converting subdued undead into allies. Then he continued in the same even voice, almost like he was stating common battlefield knowledge. It is a basic tactic when necromancers fight one another. After saying that, Cleanse glanced over the growing number of undead now standing on his side. The skeletons gathered under his command, weapons raised and bodies stiffly awaiting orders. Cleanse quietly muttered, well, this should be enough to put up a fight. Then, without wasting another second, he gave his command. Vanguard, charge forward. The skeleton soldiers surged ahead at once, moving like disciplined warriors answering a commander on the battlefield. Uncle, we are running too. With that, Cleanse and Dunkel immediately moved forward, following behind the undead army as it advanced into the darkness. As they pressed deeper into the ruins, more undead creatures began emerging from the shadows ahead, one after another. Grotesque corpses and bare-boned skeletons poured into the narrow passageways from every direction, filling the underground corridors with a chilling flood of death. Even then, Cleanse's undead army did not slow down. The forces under his command crashed straight into the enemies and tore through the hostile undead with terrifying coordination. Bones snapped, rusted blades struck against one another, and dreadful cries rang endlessly through the tight stone corridors. Dunkel watched the battle unfold in front of him, and even while fighting, he could barely believe what he was seeing. Rearguard, support the attack. Cleanse continued issuing orders with absolute precision, his voice cutting cleanly through the chaos. Keep breaking through. Every skeleton followed his commands perfectly. They moved not like mindless corpses, but like trained soldiers on a real battlefield, matching Dunkel's movements as he fought beside them. No matter how hard Dunkel tried to focus on the fight, he could not stop the thoughts racing through his mind. Even while watching it happen with his own eyes, it was almost impossible to believe. Dunkel cut down another undead and continued thinking. Skeletons were supposed to be among the lowest ranks of undead creatures, but the sight in front of him completely destroyed that common belief. These things can move like this? Like a real army? The longer he watched, the more impossible it felt. These skeletons were not fighting like wild monsters driven by instinct. They moved with coordination, tactics, and discipline, almost as if they were veteran soldiers carrying out the orders of a perfect commander. Before long, the battle finally reached its end. The countless undead enemies that had blocked their path were wiped out completely, leaving the passage littered with shattered bones and collapsed bodies. As silence slowly returned to the underground ruins, Dunkel looked across the devastation around them in stunned disbelief. We annihilated a force more than 4 times our size? Even after seeing the result, he still could not fully understand what had just happened. What in the world is this? But Cleanse only stared deeper into the darkness ahead and spoke calmly once more. From here on out, it is just the 2 of us. Cleanse continued forward through the underground ruins, his voice calm as he spoke to Dunkel beside him. You said you would believe in me. Then his eyes remained fixed on the darkness ahead, and his tone became quiet but firm. Then believe in me until the very end. Dunkel followed silently at his side for a while. As he carefully watched their surroundings, he eventually spoke again, his voice low. It seems we have come quite deep already. How much farther do we need to go? But before Cleanse could answer, something suddenly fell from above. A single drop of blood struck Dunkel directly on the face. His expression hardened at once. Slowly, Dunkel raised the torch toward the ceiling ahead, stepping forward with caution as the firelight trembled in his hand. There is someone here. But the moment the torchlight spread across the space in front of them, Dunkel froze where he stood, horror overtaking his face. Dozens of bodies hung from ropes above them. The corpses swayed faintly in the darkness, their lifeless forms dripping blood onto the cold stone floor beneath them. The stench of rot and decay filled the air so heavily that every breath felt suffocating. Dunkel stared at the gruesome sight in disbelief. What in the world is all this? Cleanse quietly looked up at the hanging corpses and calmly revealed the truth. It seems these are the villagers who were reported missing. His voice remained cold and steady as he continued. They were kidnapped and used as materials for reanimation magic. At that exact moment, another voice suddenly echoed through the chamber. As expected, you understand it very well. Cleanse and Dunkel immediately turned toward the direction of the voice. From the darkness ahead, a witch slowly stepped into view. A sinister smile curved across her face as she began to speak. Reanimation magic is a spell that revives corpses and turns them into one's familiars. She slowly spread both arms, looking almost proud as she stood among the horrifying bodies around her. That is why it requires a massive quantity of high-quality corpses. Then her eyes shifted directly toward Cleanse, and her smile widened even more. It is basic knowledge among us necromancers, is it not? The moment she said that, the air in the chamber seemed to grow even heavier. I never imagined I would meet you in a place like this. Her eyes narrowed as she addressed him with a title that should never have been spoken aloud. It has been a long time, Devil of the Continent. Then, with absolute certainty in her voice, she called him by another name, Lord Ashimon. The instant that name reached Cleanse's ears, his expression changed completely. For the first time, genuine shock broke through his calm face. And at that moment, the story once again slipped back into the past. The scene returned to the Rhineland estate. Dunkel stood beside Cleanse with a respectful posture as he asked his question. Shall we head straight to His Grace, the Duke? After hearing that, Cleanse answered calmly, Let me change my clothes first. Dunkel gave a quiet nod, but just then, Cleanse suddenly sensed a strange presence nearby. The Cleanse family had once been known as one of the strongest bloodlines on the entire continent. Inside his mind, Cleanse thought I was sure someone was there, and he had not been mistaken. Someone really had been watching him. At that very moment, Leia Ren was secretly nearby, hidden in the shadows as she silently observed everything. Then, as the memory continued, an important truth finally came to light. Necromancers. The origin of necromancers began to unfold. The word came from the terms necros, meaning corpse, and mentia, meaning divination. Originally, the term referred to those who summoned the souls of the dead in order to receive prophecies and oracles. In ancient times, necromancers were certainly feared, but they were not yet treated as absolute monsters. But everything changed after that one day. The entire world was plunged into terror by the great catastrophe that later became known across the continent as the Ashimon incident. It was a disaster unlike anything humanity had ever faced. Tens of millions of undead suddenly invaded the continent all at once. That army was beyond human understanding. They did not eat. They did not rest. They feared no pain, no exhaustion, and not even death itself. Against such enemies, ordinary warfare became completely meaningless. Cities fell one after another. Kingdoms collapsed beneath the endless tide of undead. No matter how many were cut down, more bodies kept rising from the battlefield without end. The entire continent was driven to the brink of destruction as that terrifying undead army devoured everything in its path. And above that monstrous force stood one being, Ashimon, the master who commanded the dead. The war finally ended only when the legendary hero, Berkel Rhineland, succeeded in striking Ashimon down. After the catastrophe ended, countless people became fascinated by the terrifying power that necromancy had displayed. One after another, they tried to study those forbidden arts and recreate the power that had shaken the world. But in the end, the only thing modern necromancers managed to reproduce was reanimation magic. Because of that, the necromancers of the present age had been reduced to little more than second-rate magicians, people who merely raised corpses and used them as disposable soldiers. And the necromancer now standing before Cleanse was exactly that kind of person. The scene returned to the present. The red-haired woman slowly stepped forward with a mysterious smile on her lips, then introduced herself with a graceful air. It has been a while, Lord Ashimon. Her crimson eyes remained fixed on Cleanse. I am pale. A necromancer. The moment those words were spoken, Dunkel's expression changed completely, and the shock on his face was impossible to hide. Ashimon. But before he could even fully process that name, another terrifying detail seized his attention. More importantly, even Cleanse himself narrowed his eyes. He sensed the overwhelming power surrounding her and quietly admitted, You are right. His gaze shifted toward the robe she was wearing. That is an incredible amount of mana. After observing her more carefully, Cleanse continued in a measured voice. She infused magic directly into her robe. As far as I know, only they are capable of imbuing mana into soft materials. Realizing just how dangerous the woman before them was, Dunkel immediately stepped forward and aimed his sword straight at Pale. You there. His voice rang sharply through the underground chamber. This is young Master Cleanse. His face hardened with anger as he glared at her. Do not dare call him by the name of scum like Ashamon. For a brief moment, silence fell across the chamber. Then, after noticing Cleanse's reaction, the red-haired woman suddenly smiled mischievously and let out a light laugh. I was only joking. Her tone sounded playful, but the feeling around her remained deeply unsettling. I suppose that was rude toward the young master of Rhineland? But then her smile gradually faded, and she continued in a calmer voice. Still, I do know. Her eyes locked directly onto Cleanse. The rumors surrounding you. Then her gaze sharpened slightly. And the unfamiliar magic I sensed just now. You are definitely a necromancer, just like me. The red-haired woman kept speaking while staring at Cleanse with intense interest, as though she had found something rare and fascinating. But how should I put it? For a necromancer to fight with a sword of all things, Pale's smile slowly stretched wider, as though the very thought was so strange that she could not help finding it amusing. But before she could continue mocking him, Dunkel suddenly stepped forward, anger flashing across his face as he cut her off. Stop spouting nonsense and answer the question. His sword stayed aimed directly at her, the tip steady despite the tension in the air. What did you do to those people? His expression grew even colder as his voice rose again. And who ordered you to do this? The red-haired necromancer, however, acted as if Dunkel's questions meant nothing at all. She simply ignored him, slowly lifting one hand as she continued speaking in her own rhythm. A true necromancer does not rely on tools. As those words left her lips, dark mana began spilling from her body, spreading outward in every direction like a shadowy tide. We command souls. The air inside the underground chamber grew thick and oppressive in an instant, as if death itself had pressed down on their shoulders. And we control death. The moment Pale released that dark energy, every corpse hanging around the chamber suddenly reacted at once, their lifeless bodies jerking violently in the gloom. The dead bodies began twitching in unnatural spasms, while black magic crawled through them like a curse sinking deep into their flesh. Bones cracked sharply in the silence. Rotten flesh twisted and warped, bending into shapes no living body should ever take. The entire chamber trembled under the pressure of that overwhelming mana. Dunkel immediately stepped back in alarm, his eyes locked on the horrific transformation unfolding right in front of them. Pale slowly spread both arms, almost like she was proudly presenting the greatest treasure she had ever created. So, let me show you. A terrifying smile crept across her face. The true meaning of necromancy. Then, with her voice thick with obsession and madness, she declared what stood behind her. The masterpiece I dedicated my entire life to. At that exact moment, something enormous began pushing its way out from the darkness ahead. First came a gigantic hand, massive enough to make the shadows around it seem small. Then a pair of huge legs slowly stepped forward, each movement shaking the underground chamber with violent force. The creature was so enormous that even the ceiling seemed far too low to contain its body. Dunkel stared up at the monster, his face filled with complete disbelief. This is insane. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke. I have never seen anything like this, not even on the battlefield. The gigantic creature slowly revealed its full shape from the darkness, exposing a massive one-eyed monster. Dunkel's eyes widened as realization struck him. That is definitely a cyclops. Meanwhile, Pale approached the gigantic monster with gentle steps, as if she were walking toward a beloved pet instead of a terrifying beast. Her voice suddenly softened into something strangely affectionate. Come here, baby. The enormous cyclops lowered itself slightly toward her. I am so sorry. Pale reached out and gently placed her hand against its massive body. It must have been difficult holding yourself back this whole time, right? Then she slowly pointed toward Cleanse and Dunkel standing ahead, and her smile twisted into something horrifying. I have a favor to ask you. The Cyclops released a deep, monstrous growl that rumbled through the underground ruins. Then Pale's voice turned cold with excitement as she gave the order. Crush those two into a pulp. The enormous monster immediately launched itself forward. It charged straight toward Cleanse and Dunkel with terrifying speed, its massive footsteps pounding against the ground and shaking the entire underground chamber as though an earthquake were tearing through the ruins. The instant Dunkel saw the Cyclops move, his eyes widened in shock. It is incredibly fast. The gigantic creature closed the distance almost immediately. And the moment Dunkel realized the young master's life was in immediate danger, he shouted at the top of his lungs. "It is dangerous, young master." But at that exact moment, Cleanse suddenly pushed Dunkel away with all the strength he had. Dunkel's body was thrown backward across the ground. At the same time, the Cyclops' devastating attack came crashing down, landing directly on Cleanse instead. The impact violently shook the underground ruins, sending a heavy shockwave through the stone chamber. Cleanse was blown far into the distance, his body flying helplessly before crashing hard against the cold stone floor. Dust and broken debris scattered everywhere. After taking the attack head-on, Cleanse's condition immediately became terrible. His body left battered from the force of the blow. Meanwhile, the gigantic Cyclops slowly stood before him again, its enormous shadow looming over Cleanse's fallen body. The monster raised its massive arm high, preparing to crush Cleanse completely before he could even recover. But before that attack could come down, Dunkel suddenly appeared between them. With a furious roar, he swung his sword with all his strength, driving the blade straight toward the Cyclops. "Stay away from the young master." The powerful slash struck the monster head-on, and a loud impact rang out through the chamber like metal crashing against stone. Seeing Dunkel throw himself forward like that, even Cleanse looked momentarily surprised. At the same time, Pale watched the battle calmly from a distance, amusement glimmering in her eyes, as if this was all part of her entertainment. "That was a splendid strike, Mr. Knight." Her smile slowly widened as she praised him in that unsettlingly calm voice. "But with that level of talent, you cannot even leave a scratch on my masterpiece." Dunkel's expression stiffened the moment he heard those words, because right then, he saw the truth with his own eyes. The Cyclops' injured leg was already regenerating. Its flesh twisted unnaturally, knitting itself back together until the damage vanished as though it had never existed. Dunkel stared at the sight in disbelief. Its leg is growing back? For one brief second, fear flashed through his mind. But then his gaze shifted toward Cleanse, who lay injured behind him. "It does not matter." Dunkel's grip tightened around the sword hilt. "The young master threw himself into danger to save me." That thought struck him harder than any blow. With a body that does not even possess a trace of mana. Dunkel lowered his head slightly, shame weighing heavily over him. "I cannot believe I actually dared to suspect someone like him of being Ashimon." The guilt in his heart grew heavier than ever before. Meanwhile, the gigantic Cyclops charged toward them once again with monstrous force. Dunkel immediately rushed forward to intercept it. He unleashed countless rapid strikes across the monster's massive body, his sword moving faster and faster as sparks burst with every impact. Slash after slash crashed against the Cyclops without pause, yet no matter how many times he attacked, it felt completely meaningless. Even so, Dunkel refused to stop. There is only one way to repay this shame. His breathing grew heavier and rougher as he kept fighting desperately. "I will put my life on the line." Another powerful strike landed against the monster's body. "And I will protect the young master." After Dunkel unleashed countless attacks, a small wound finally appeared on the Cyclops' body. But before he could feel even the slightest relief, the flesh immediately began regenerating right in front of him again. Within moments, the wound disappeared completely. Dunkel's eyes widened with frustration and disbelief. "Damn it." His expression darkened as he watched the monster restore itself once more. The battle dragged on, growing fiercer and more desperate with every passing moment. Even after realizing the Cyclops possessed terrifying regenerative abilities, Dunkel still refused to back down or give up. He rushed forward once again, forcing his exhausted body into motion as he unleashed several more powerful strikes against the gigantic monster. His sword slammed repeatedly into its massive frame, each blow carrying all the strength he could gather. But no matter how many blows Dunkel landed, none of them seemed to leave any lasting damage. Every strike that should have mattered was swallowed by the Cyclops' monstrous body, as if it had no real effect at all. The Cyclops simply continued advancing, its massive frame pushing forward like an unstoppable wall. Then, in the very next moment, the monster swung one of its enormous arms straight toward Dunkel. Boom! The devastating blow slammed directly into him with terrifying force. Dunkel's body was violently hurled across the underground chamber, flying through the air like a broken doll. He smashed heavily against the stone wall, the impact echoing through the ruins before his body collapsed onto the ground. In an instant, his condition became severe from the sheer force of the attack. Watching Dunkel fall, the red-haired necromancer slowly smiled, as if the sight only made her more pleased with her own creation. "Truly is beyond my imagination." Pale's eyes shone with obsession and pride as she gazed up at the gigantic creature she had brought into existence. Her expression was almost moved, and the truth behind her madness began to surface. Her endless fixation on necromancy had consumed her entire life. She had conducted experiment after experiment, chasing forbidden knowledge that went far beyond ordinary understanding, until her research eventually pushed past the limits of conventional necromancy itself. And at last, she succeeded in creating a completely unique variant, something no one else could ever reproduce. Because of that achievement, Pale believed one thing with absolute certainty. This was innate talent. Her voice trembled with excitement, overflowing with the thrill of her own accomplishment. Not even Ashimon himself could create something like this. Her smile twisted with overwhelming pride, arrogance pouring from every word. I have surpassed Ashimon's knowledge. Meanwhile, on the other side of the battlefield, the Cyclops slowly lifted Dunkel's broken body into the air with one massive hand, preparing to crush him completely. But at that exact moment, a calm voice suddenly echoed through the chamber. Core connection point. Cleanse slowly walked forward as he spoke, his tone so steady that it sounded almost like he was explaining something simple. That is the first key to synthesizing a Cyclops. The monster still held Dunkel suspended in the air, yet Cleanse continued approaching without the slightest fear. The second is the core suture. His eyes stayed fixed entirely on the Cyclops. That is why its limbs regenerate even after being severed. Then he added quietly, it is also the source of its regenerative power. In that moment, the atmosphere changed. Even Pale's expression began to stiffen as she listened. So how do you kill that thing? Cleanse continued in the same calm voice, answering the question himself as if he had known the truth from the beginning. Attacking its body directly like Dunkel did is pointless. Cleanse slowly raised his weapon, his gaze never leaving the monster. All it takes is destroying a single core and it is over. Pale's eyes widened slightly at his words. Then where exactly is that core? Cleanse answered without hesitation. A Cyclops core never stays in one place. His gaze sharpened, cold and precise, because that single point is directly connected to its death. Constantly moves throughout the body. Cleanse took another step forward, his voice remaining steady, just like blood flowing through veins. The moment he said that, the confidence on Pale's face finally began to crack. That is impossible, she shouted. Finding it is impossible because it never stops moving. Then she desperately pointed toward her masterpiece once again. Did you not hear what I said earlier? Her voice grew louder, more unstable, and more frantic. This is the masterpiece I devoted my entire life to creating. She stretched out her hand, her voice burning with killing intent as she gave another order. In the face of true talent, you are nothing. Then she screamed toward the Cyclops, crush him. At that very moment, Cleanse quietly closed his eyes for a brief second. Memories from his previous life flashed through his mind. He remembered slaughtering thousands upon thousands of Cyclopes across countless battlefields, again and again, until the sensation had been carved into his instincts. The memory was so vivid it felt as if it had happened only yesterday. All he needed to do now was trust those instincts once more. Then, in a single instant, Cleanse moved. A sharp flash sliced through the darkness. Before anyone could react, his attack pierced straight through the Cyclops' moving core with absolute precision. Crack! The core shattered completely. The gigantic monster froze in place, as if every part of its body had stopped at once. Then its massive frame began collapsing piece by piece before crashing lifelessly onto the ground. Silence filled the underground chamber. Pale stared at the destroyed Cyclops in complete disbelief. What exactly are you? Her voice trembled, and for the first time, fear appeared across her face. Cleanse looked at her calmly and answered in a cold voice. If this is what you devoted your entire life to creating. His eyes remained completely emotionless, without even the slightest trace of pity. Then perhaps you should make it a hobby in your next life.